How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014, so there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a battling stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good afternoon, everyone. The next item of business is statement by John Swinney on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Incorporation Scotland Bill, a revolution in children's rights. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call John Swinney. 10 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I am delighted to confirm that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Incorporation Scotland Bill, which was introduced to Parliament yesterday, has today been published and will begin its parliamentary passage. This is one of the most significant pieces of legislation to be considered by Parliament in the 20 years since devolution. It is a bill of the highest constitutional and legal significance, but one which must also transform the lives of our children. If approved by Parliament, this bill will mean that Scotland is the first country in the United Kingdom to directly incorporate children's rights into domestic law. I want to thank the children and young people and children's rights defenders who have campaigned for this bill and made it possible. The Scottish Government is committed to fully realising the human rights of all people in Scotland. We are committed to building a Scotland where respect for human rights anchors our society and the institutions which govern and deliver public services for the people of Scotland. The bill represents a significant step on the road to fully realising that future for Scotland, a future based on tolerance, equality, shared values and respect for the worth and human dignity of all of our people. The dual impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union underline the importance of human rights being built into the fabric of society. Nowhere is this more important than in relation to children and young people whose futures depend on the action taken by all public authorities to implement their rights in practice. Children's rights matter now more than ever. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is the global gold standard for children's rights. By incorporating these rights directly into the law in Scotland, the bill will revolutionise how we protect, respect and fulfil children's rights. It will ensure that children and young people are involved in the decisions that affect their lives and communities. Where breaches of children's rights occur, the bill will mean for the first time that children and young people can use the courts to enforce those rights. The bill takes a maximalist approach and will deliver the highest protection for children's rights possible within the boundaries set by the Scotland Act. The rights and obligations in the UNCRC and the first and second optional protocols are incorporated fully and directly using the language of the Convention itself to the maximum extent of the Scottish Parliament's powers. It is of fundamental importance that all children and young people can access and enforce their rights. I can confirm that the bill will therefore apply to all children and young people under the age of 18, in line with the recommendations of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. The definition of public authority in the bill has been drawn intentionally wide. The duty in the bill will apply to public authorities to the fullest extent possible within the powers of the Parliament. This includes the devolved functions of core public bodies like local authorities, health boards and the police, and the devolved functions of public bodies with mixed devolved and reserved functions. The bill makes it clear that the duty applies to the Scottish ministers and the courts. The duty in the bill also applies to private bodies when exercising functions of a public nature. Whilst the duty cannot apply so as to modify the law on reserved matters, it may apply in some circumstances to reserved functions where this could not modify the law on reserved matters. This will require that careful consideration must be given to the circumstances of children and young people in practice. Human rights can only be fully realised in Scotland if all the institutions of the state take action to respect, protect and fulfil the rights that belong to every member of Scottish society. That would include this Parliament. The Scottish Government recognises that further consideration requires to be given by Parliament itself to how the requirements of the bill should be applied to its functions, and looks forward to working with members of Parliament on this question during the passage of the bill. The duty on public authorities in the bill follows the model of the Human Rights Act, requiring that public authorities must not act incompatibly with the rights and obligations incorporated by the bill. The duty in the Human Rights Act is well understood, and the approach will provide as stable a framework as possible. Children have their human rights, as set out in the European Convention on Human Rights, protected by the Human Rights Act. This bill ensures that children and young people have legal protection for their children's rights also. My ambition has been to ensure that the bill puts in place the highest level of protection for children's rights as possible. My preferred approach would be to require all legislation, past and future, to be compatible with children's rights, with the courts having the power to strike down incompatible legislation. That reflects a founding principle of this Parliament, that this institution exists to serve every member of Scottish society. The power to pass legislation that breaches human rights is not one which this Parliament should have, and nor do I think it is a power which members wish to have. However, provision requiring future legislation to be compatible with the UNCRC would alter the competence of the Parliament and is not therefore something that can currently be delivered by an act of this Parliament. In line with the maximalist approach, it is my intention that a court should be able to strike down legislation where this is possible. The bill therefore provides for different remedies in relation to legislation that predates and postdates commencement of the bill. The bill will enable the courts to strike down incompatible legislation which predates commencement of the bill. For legislation that postdates commencement of the bill, the courts will be able to declare that legislation incompatible. The bill also ensures that damages can be awarded by the courts by way of just satisfaction. The benefits of this approach will be that as far as is possible within the powers of this Parliament, breaches of children's rights in historic legislation cannot endure. In relation to future legislation, a finding by the courts that legislation is incompatible will bring transparency to breaches of children's rights. Other measures in the bill put in place a very strong framework to ensure compatibility of legislation with children's rights in practice. The bill requires Scottish ministers to publish child rights and wellbeing impact assessments and to make statements of compatibility for government primary and secondary legislation. This will bring greater transparency and accountability for children's rights into the legislative process. Ministers will also be required to undertake children's rights and wellbeing impact assessments in relation to strategic decision-making. The bill requires ministers to publish a children's rights scheme on an annual basis, setting out what arrangements they have made or propose to fulfil the UNCRC compatibility duty. Ministers will also be required to report on the progress made and plans ahead for children's rights. The Children's Rights Scheme and reporting requirements will aid transparency and scrutiny of how the Scottish Ministers fulfil their obligations under the bill to ensure that children's rights are considered proactively and fully implemented in practice. Building on the progress made under the Children and Young People Scotland Act 2014, public authorities which are listed in the bill will continue to be required to report every 3 years. Children and young people face additional barriers to realising their rights and accessing justice. The bill introduces specific measures in recognition of this fact. These include ensuring that claims are not time-barred during childhood and giving the Children and Young People's Commission in Scotland the power to raise claims in the public interest. In order to bring further transparency and accountability for breaches of children's rights, the bill will require Scottish ministers to report to the Scottish Parliament within 6 months following a court's decision to strike down or declare legislation incompatible. The bill will also include remedial powers similar to those that exist in relation to the European Convention on Human Rights, to enable ministers to take steps quickly to amend legislation which is found to be incompatible or which is potentially incompatible. The bill builds upon a strong track record across public authorities of implementing children's rights in Scotland. The Scottish Government is committed to ensuring public bodies are supported to fully implement the bill and will work in partnership with them on a £2 million implementation programme over 3 years. The bill will mean that children, young people and their families will experience public authorities consistently acting to uphold the rights of all children in Scotland. It will ensure that there is a proactive culture of everyday accountability for children's rights across public services in Scotland. The Scottish Government wants a Scotland where policy, law and decision-making take account of children's rights. We want a Scotland where all children have a voice and are empowered not just to know and understand their rights, but also to assert and defend those rights and the rights of others. Fully realising the fundamental human rights of children and young people is essential to building the more prosperous, equal future which the Scottish Government wants for everyone in Scotland, especially for our children. Today, we embark on a parliamentary journey to fully realise the rights of all children and young people in Scotland. This is a landmark day to secure the rights and the future of Scotland's children.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I'll allow around 20 minutes for that. After that, we'll move on to the next item of business. Would those members who wish to ask a question press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement? These benches will fully support measures which protect and enhance the rights of children and young people in domestic legislation and those of international conventions. And I do commend the efforts of those in this chamber and out with who have been faithful to their promises on bringing this to this Parliament. We will work with the Scottish Government on this bill, scrutinise and improve it where we can, and make sure that the consultation is wide and respectful. But there is no doubt a myriad of very technical and legal questions which might arise from this bill, no least how this piece of law will work alongside the UK Human Rights Act, which itself transposes the European Convention of Human Rights into UK law. So can I ask, and this is largely a technical question to the Cabinet Secretary, what assessment has he or his government undertaking in advance of the publication of this bill between any interactions, interplays or potential conflicts between the rights as set out in this law, any other UK relevant legislation, laws of the European and UN respective conventions, and any areas where there are clearly divisions between what is devolved or reserved matters, any potential conflict between the above, and the complex hierarchy and interaction between multiple conventions and pieces of law. And can I ask what firm mechanisms will be in place to ensure that any conflicts which do arise will be dealt with fairly, so that future bills passed by this Parliament do not spend needless or endless months in the courts, something which I think will serve no one any good?
John Swinney.
President Officer, I wholeheartedly agree with Jamie Green that there will be a myriad of technical questions here, and many of these questions are issues with which I have wrestled significantly in the course of the last couple of years as we have prepared this bill. The bill has been designed to try to avoid all of the challenges that Mr Green has set out. And I stress the word designed. Parliament will have to scrutinise that to satisfy itself that we have got the design architecture correct in the bill. Mr Green will know that this Parliament is required by virtue of the Scotland Act to act in a fashion that is compatible with our legislation must be compatible with the terms of the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. So and that is a requirement of the Scotland Act which we cannot breach, so that requires us to act in a particular way, and the bill is designed to be compatible with that requirement. There will, of course, be a range of questions where we cannot fully incorporate the provisions of the UNCRC because of reserved questions. And there are a number of technical examples of that, which, of course, we will happily explore with Parliament as we proceed through the scrutiny of the legislation. But we have designed a bill which has as its intent the enhancement of the rights and the protection of the rights of children and young people in our society, but in a fashion that is compatible with the existing legal framework within which we have to operate. Final point I would say is that Mr Green talked about the role of the courts, and I suspect this will be an issue of some controversy, and I know that members will be anxious to avoid legislation being challenged within the courts. But in all honesty, that is one of the powerful elements of this bill, that we create the opportunity for legislation to be challenged in the courts by children if there is the view that their rights are being infringed. And I think that's an essential part of the approach that we're taking in the bill.
Mary Fee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement. As a long-standing supporter of incorporating the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, I welcome the announcement that was made by the First Minister yesterday and the statement and commitment that has been given by the Cabinet Secretary today. The bill has widespread support, not just in Parliament, but in civic society. And delivering its aims will require a full understanding of children's rights and will require appropriate funding. And the 2 million funding package sounds low to achieve the full aims of incorporation. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how the Scottish Government will ensure that those who will be more impacted in delivering this bill, such as local authorities and integrated joint boards, will be appropriately funded to deliver all of the aims of the bill?
John Swinney.
First of all, can I acknowledge the long-standing contribution that Mary Fee has made to this debate on the question of incorporation and the consistent support that she has given for such an approach to be taken. And I'm sure in the consideration of the bill, she will bring that significant expertise to bear in the scrutiny process, and I welcome that. In relation to the question of funding, I've set out the funding approaches that we will take in relation to the implementation programme. But the point I would make to Mary Fee is that what this bill has to do, and it's really one of the critical points in my statement, the bill must enable the creation of a proactive culture of everyday accountability for children's rights. So I don't consider this to be an issue or a question that is solved by the allocation of money to public authorities. It is about changing or making sure the culture of public authorities is operating appropriately to protect children's rights. And I don't think that's about so much the amount of money that's spent, it's the outlook and the perspective of organisations. And many do a very, very good and accomplished task in this respect. But we need to focus on the creation of that everyday culture. And I hope that's the product that comes out of the passage of the bill.
We now move on to open questions. I would like to get them all in, so if we could be aware of the length of questions and answers, please. Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary expand on how the bill will in practice help children realise and enforce their rights? For instance, what support will be available to ensure that all children, no matter their background or resources, or indeed the resources of their parents, are able to do just that?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the bill essentially fulfils the objectives that Ruth Maguire has talked about in two respects. Firstly, by creating the opportunity for young people to challenge legislation in the fashion about which they are concerned. And secondly, by also empowering the Children and Young People's Commissioner to be able to make such interventions into the bargain. So that combination of the individual and the advocacy role of the Children's and Young People's Commissioner is an important balance. I think the other point, and I suspect I will come back to this point frequently in the course of my answers, will be that point on culture that I talked about in my answers to Mary Fee, of the importance of changing the way in which public authorities act to ensure that they are operating fully cognizant of their obligations to fulfil children's rights.
Alison Johnson, followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you. I warmly welcome today's announcement that the Government intends to incorporate the URC into Scots law, a long-held policy of my own party. Now, I'd like to thank all those who've campaigned to this end for many years, but for this important bill to have maximum impact, for the 54 articles to make a real difference, for these rights to feel really real, it's really key that all who work and interact with our young people understand and know what these rights are. And that's everyone from parents, carers, health professionals, social workers, even sports coaches and many more. So how will the Scottish Government go about ensuring that the learning takes place so that this bill can have the maximal impact that we would all desire? Thank you.
John Swinney.
President Officer, I welcome Alison Johnson's support and acknowledge the long-standing commitment of the Scottish Green Party to this question, and I'm glad that we've got to this point where we can engage on this discussion and the passage of this legislation. The key point here is about ensuring that all organisations are operating in a fashion in all of their actions that the respecting and the pursuit of children's rights is an integral part of the way in which organisations operate. And that will be at the heart of the approach the Scottish Government takes of raising awareness and requiring approaches to be taken that reflect the necessity of all organisations to act compatibly with the terms of the United Nations Convention. And that will be what I mean by fulfilling the everyday culture of respecting children's rights within public bodies.
Claire Adamson, followed by Alison Harris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. One of the lesser-known provisions of the UNCRC relates to the prevention of accidents. In particular, Article 19 guarantees the right to protection from injury, and Article 24 outlines the right to access information, education and support in the prevention of accidents. As a convener of the cross-party group on accident prevention and safety awareness, I have to point out that this aspect of policy is often overlooked, despite accidents disproportionately impacting on children from our most deprived areas. With this social justice issue in mind, can I ask the Scottish Government how it will protect and promote these rights to put accident prevention higher on the political agenda?
John Swinney.
President Officer, I acknowledge the long-standing interest of Claire Adamson in this subject and would make the point that this bill should not be considered in isolation from the wider agenda which I think is best summed up by the concept of getting it right for every child, which is a policy outlook and perspective which was not, which has been taken forward by this government, but which originated in the previous government that predated this administration. So there has been a long-standing policy commitment within Scotland to work to enhance and to improve the life experience of children within our society. There are many areas in where that has demonstrated very clear progress. We have obviously had a challenging period with COVID, which has made that ever more acute as a challenge for some of our young people. But the work that Claire Addison has highlighted is important to be reflected in that wider perspective of ensuring that we actively and supportively improve the quality of life of children in our society and their safety into the bargain.
Alison Harris, followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned children challenging their rights in court. So may I ask, how do you actually envisage children paying for this court action? The legal aid system is already fundamentally challenged. So if I was a child, how would I actually take this challenge to court? Would I have to rely on parents? Could you possibly explain?
John Swinney.
Well, there are a variety of approaches that can be taken, not least of which is the one which I gave in my earlier answer, which was about the work that young people can take forward, where the Children Young People's Commissioner has an advocacy role on behalf of children, which is one of the routes. And obviously there are legal aid provisions which are available in that respect into the bargain. But fundamentally, what we are acknowledging in this bill is the importance of children being able to challenge legislation where they believe their rights are being compromised. And I think that's a proposition which opens up a new area of influence for children to exercise their voice, to be empowered within our society, and one which the government fundamentally welcomes.
Fulton McGregor, followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I also say that I fully welcome the announcement of this bill. Can the Cabinet Secretary set out how the inclusion of the UNCRC in Scots law will complement current children's human rights frameworks used by the Scottish Government, such as the routine publishing of children's rights and wellbeing impact assessments?
John Swinney.
I think the fundamental additional element which will emerge from the passage of this bill will be the requirement on public authorities not to act incompatibly with children's rights. And I think that obligation is the strongest degree of obligation we could have put on public bodies as a consequence of the legislation. There are other approaches which are not as acute as the compatibility duty that we have chosen, and that is designed to signal the importance the government attaches to ensuring that that public bodies operate in a fashion at all times that fully respect the rights of children. And that will be, and the decision to establish the broadest possible scope and perspective of the organisations, the public bodies that will be affected, means that this power or this legislative requirement will have the greatest effect within public policy within Scotland.
Pauline McNeill, followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that if the bill is to mean anything to children and young people, then you have to reach ordinary young people and children without a connection to the political class? And that might even mean the Children's Commissioner himself. For example, can the Cabinet Secretary say that a young person who may be in need of mental health services or other necessary life support to secure their well-being and their future, can this bill enhance their lives in a way that they can understand?
John Swinney.
I think there's two particular perspectives in responding to Pauline McNeill's question. One is in relation to the work that is undertaken within our education system, where I know from my own personal experience, both as a minister and as a father, whereby the understanding of the rights of children is now a very central part of our curricular approach within Scotland, and I often hear about it when I get home at night on certain issues. So there is that perspective, but there is also the fact that we can we can engage young people through organisations with whom they have a relationship. And I think, for example, about Young Scot, which has got a very strong and clear relationship with young people. I don't think it falls into the classification of being part of the political system, but it does have extraordinary reach into young people. And once young people are enabled to understand their rights and to be able to exercise those rights, the challenges that Polly McNeill highlights, I think, can be fulfilled. But we have to acknowledge the importance of equipping young people with that knowledge and understanding of their rights, which is a central provision of the bill.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I warmly congratulate the Government on bringing forward this bill? It's something I've campaigned for the last 20 years. Several members have already alluded to the fact that this legislation will only be as strong as the access to justice it offers to children through the courts. But that's about more than just striking down bad legislation. The Cabinet Secretary has identified one route through the Children's Commissioner's Office to litigate test cases in the public interest, but that's an exceptionally narrow bottleneck. Children's rights are violated every day. So what additional provisions will this government consider to ensure that any child has at any time the right to legal redress through their courts when their individual rights are violated?
John Swinney.
I think there's a couple of different dimensions in that question. One is about the point that I've made on a number of occasions already to members, which is about the actions and the outlook of public bodies to protect and to properly address the rights of children, and that comes into the operational priorities of different organisations. And that is the easiest way by which the rights of young people are protected, because they don't have to go to court because they've actually had a good and positive experience of being supported by public services. The other is about ensuring that there is a route by which young people can exercise that challenge if they believe their rights have been infringed. And the example I cited about the Children and Young People's Commissioner is a mechanism available through the bill. Obviously, we are engaged in a parliamentary process about the bill. I will remain very open to discussing these questions with members of Parliament. I acknowledge the long-standing interest that Mr Cole-Hamilton has had on this subject, and I'm quite sure in the course of the parliamentary proceedings we can discuss how any other routes or approaches can be taken forward.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome the Cabinet Secretary's clarification that all devolved bodies, as well, of course, as the Scottish Government and the courts, will be bound by the obligations to respect children's rights under the bill. In terms of how this will operate in practice, can the Cabinet Secretary advise as to whether the declarations on compatibility approach of the Human Rights Act will in fact be followed here under this bill?
John Swinney.
The approach the government intends to take, or a preferred policy, would be to require all legislation passed in future to be compatible with the UNCRC, with the courts having to strike down incompatible legislation. Now, I explained in my statement the challenge about future legislation. So the bill provides for two different remedies in respective legislation which is found to be incompatible. In relation to the primary legislation which predates the bill, the strike-down provision will exist for the courts, and in future legislation, the government will be required to set out, to essentially make a compatibility assessment of any primary and secondary legislation that we're bringing forward to ensure that is compatible with children's rights.
I've decided to allow the last two questions, but if you would be succinct, it would help. Thank you, Jeremy Balfour, followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to set out any additional rights and protection disabled children will receive in line with Article 23?
John Swinney.
Article 23 gives young people the opportunity to ensure that their own particular interests and perspectives can be fully respected, and I think it is drafted. One of the criticisms of the UNCRC is that it is not, in all of its language, an absolutely precise document. I think that's a good thing, because what that then leaves open is the scope for Parliament to take a maximalist approach. It leaves open the scope for the courts to take a maximalist approach in how they protect the rights of children and young people, and particularly those children and young people with disabilities that Mr Balfour raised.
Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that it is crucial that in this Parliament we take an outward-looking international approach to human rights through UNCRC incorporation, particularly at a time when the UK Government is diminishing its international standing through leaving the EU and previously even threatening to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights?
John Swinney.
So one of the, I think, one of the great strides forward that's taken place during my lifetime has been the enormous progress that has been made on the human rights of individuals. And so much of that has emanated by the thinking that has emerged through the European Convention on Human Rights and its significant influence on the Human Rights Act in the United Kingdom. So I very much hope that the incorporation of the Convention into domestic legislation into Scots law will be viewed as a signal by this government and this Parliament of our determination to take a human rights-based approach to all of our policy outlook and interventions. And I think that sets out a direction about who we are and what we aspire to do within our society, which respects the values which are enshrined on the mace of the Parliament that sits in front of us and in front of the presiding officer, and which reflects very much the country that we want to be.
That concludes questions on the statement by John Swinney. Can I remind members that social distancing measures are in place across the chamber and the campus, and take care to observe these measures over the course of this afternoon's business, particularly when entering and exiting the chamber. We'll now move on to the next item of business, and that is a debate without motion on the Scottish Government's Programme for Government 2020-21. Can I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, please? And I call on Fiona Hislop to speak to and move the motion for up to 8 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, COVID-19 has changed almost everything. Lockdown has had an impact on our public services, economy and people, changed the way we work, socialise and questions what we once knew as normal. We have seen a public health crisis become a global economic crisis. Growth has reduced and there have been many job losses, with the expectation, sadly, of more to come. KPMG is forecasting that Scotland's economic growth is expected to contract by 9.1% in 2020 and the UK to contract by 10.3%. It has highlighted the inequalities in our society. Those with the least before the crisis have been often the worst affected. Yesterday, the First Minister set out our programme for government. I will focus on the first major theme, a national mission to create new jobs, good jobs and green jobs, with a particular focus on our young people, supporting retraining and investing in our Green New Deal as part of our green recovery. Delivering on this mission will require a collective effort to tackle the fundamental inequalities in our society, ensuring we use this moment to create the fairer, greener and wealthier country we all want to see. We will work with businesses, large and small, unions and the third sector to achieve this mission. We will put equality and human rights at the heart of our approach and do all we can to ensure everyone in Scotland receives the support they need, taking action to tackle the systemic injustices in our society. We will not allow youth unemployment and the scarring effect it would have on a generation to be the legacy of this pandemic. Presiding Officer, I am pleased to confirm that today we will be publishing the initial report on the Youth Guarantee produced by Sandy Begbie, who I invited to lead this work, given his experience in developing the Edinburgh Guarantee. This plan will see every young person guaranteed an opportunity in education, a job or training. I would like to thank Sandy Begbie for his work to develop this proposal in such a short period of time. He has engaged widely and set out ambitious recommendations for which I am grateful, and I look forward to working with him to implement them. We will begin by moving quickly to invest the £60 million in a way which recognises the importance of local flexibility and the critical role of colleges in delivering meaningful opportunities for young people. This will mean providing £30 million to local authorities to deliver flexible local responses through local partnerships, which can help keep people in work and support young people and local employers. £10 million to create additional opportunities in colleges. £10 million to support pre-apprenticeship activity with Skills Development Scotland and colleges. And £10 million to build on the successful Developing the Young Workforce infrastructure. While I have welcomed the investment in the UK-wide Kickstart scheme, I was disappointed to note that it has launched today without any formal notification and a lack of meaningful consultation in Scotland. We are, however, committed to working with the United Kingdom Government to ensure our offers are aligned and deliver for young people. That's what they and businesses rightly expect of us. And I'll be writing to the Secretary of State again today to seek a meeting to ensure that this happens. The scale of this challenge will be significant, but I know many employers share our commitment to young people. Sandy Begbie has secured early support from a range of high-profile employers, including Scottish Power, Standard Life Aberdeen and Scottish Water. The public sector also needs to play its role, so the Scottish Government will also support the guarantee. This must be a collective national endeavour. Government cannot do this alone. We need employers across the public, private and third sectors who can to play their part and work with us to create more opportunities, recognising the valuable contribution our young people can make to growing our economy. Presiding Officer, in addition, we will commit to a £25 million National Transition Training Fund, supporting up to 10,000 people facing redundancy and unemployment in those sectors and regions most exposed to the current economic downturn. And a £2.35 million increase to the Parental Employability Support Fund, supporting parents most at risk of poverty, including disabled people and young parents. We will also extend Fair Start Scotland for a further 2 years to March 2023. We are putting in place ways to improve fair work practices, to tackle the discrimination and unfair practices towards women and ethnic migrants. We will begin to develop a new centre for workplace transformation, helping businesses and organisations embrace new business models, drive workplace innovation and to become more inclusive. With local government, we will progress our ambitions for 20-minute neighbourhoods, creating places with thriving local economies, supporting local SMEs and places where people can meet their daily needs within a 20-minute walk. Also supporting the Work Local Challenge, developing more shared local working hubs for private, public and third sectors, and enabling more flexible and remote working. The pandemic has underlined the economic importance of increasing Scotland's digital confidence. We have already almost tripled our investment in Digital Boost for the remainder of 2021, supporting Scotland's SMEs to improve their digital capability and productivity. We accept the key recommendations in the Logan Review of Scotland's tech ecosystem and have already announced that we will establish a national network of world-class start-up incubators together with an ecosystem fund. We will also create a formal partnership with industry to develop an implementation plan for the remaining recommendations. We are also committing an additional £23 million this year to tackle digital exclusion, providing a device, free internet connection and training to bring 50,000 people online by the end of 2021. Oh, a surfeit of choices. I think Murdo was first.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. On the question of the digital divide, do we as yet have a new completion date for the R100 programme to roll out superfast broadband to every household in Scotland?
Fiona Hislop.
Well, the commitment is there. There will be an announcement from Paul Wheelhouse very, very soon, which I think the member would be interested in. But a very important point. We can be a world-class destination for inward investment for the types of companies that know that their workforce can remote work anywhere in the most beautiful country in the world. What kind of offer is that? Ian Gray.
Ian Gray.
I wanted to refer back to the Logan Review. They made some recommendations around school education and computer science, which I think were quite powerful. But one thing they didn't address was the biggest problem in that sector in our schools, which is the complete absence of people willing to teach computer science. How does the Cabinet Secretary think that can be addressed?
Fiona Hislop. So the Deputy First Minister and I have spoken to Mark Logan. He's engaging in this issue. I'm sure the Deputy First Minister might want to remark on this on his closing of this debate. But the member identifies a real key issue, because many people can earn much more than they would in teaching. But as he will know, you have to have a passion for young people and children to teach. But what better way to help your country recover from the pandemic than for people from industry to engage in this? So industry engagement will be absolutely critical, but I think he's addressing a real challenge in there, and how we can work together to make sure we have the talented people that we need, to ensure that we have the capacity that we need for the numbers that we need to take up that tech challenge. Presiding Officer, we're already committed more than £800 million to support economic recovery and restart, including a £230 million package for new capital projects, more than £470 million for the transport and culture sectors, and £100 million to help people into work. We've also welcomed the UK Government's job retention scheme and will continue to argue for its extension. Our Green New Deal provides businesses with the confidence to invest in people and help us transition to a net zero economy. Our £100 million Green Jobs Fund will support job creation by helping businesses, particularly SMEs, develop and expand the production of green products and services by ensuring businesses and supply chains can benefit from public and private investment in the transition to a low-carbon future. And we'll invest £1.6 billion over the next Parliament to decarbonise our buildings. We will establish a £62 million energy transition fund, accelerating the transition to net zero in the energy sector. And we will invest £150 million in forestry as well. Our National Infrastructure Mission will deliver by 2025 annual infrastructure investment of £1.5 billion higher than 1920. And we'll also be launching our Scottish National Investment Bank. We'll be taking Scotland to the world with an inward investment plan generating the potential of 100,000 high-value jobs over the next decade. Presiding Officer, in closing, the programme for government has economic renewal and the creation of new, good, green jobs at its very core. Progress will only be possible through collaboration between government, industry and the third sector. We will need collective determination to succeed. But, Presiding Officer, I am confident that Scotland is up to the challenge.
Can I, first of all, apologise to the Cabinet Secretary for asking to move a motion that didn't in fact exist, and apologise to the Chamber for the confusion and clarify that this is in fact a debate without motion. And I now call on Murdo Fraser for up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's become something of a cliche to say we are living in difficult times, but it's no less true for all that. This is the background to the programme for government delivered yesterday, an unprecedented health challenge which is rapidly transforming into a significant economic challenge, probably greater than any one of us have encountered in our lifetimes. So what we need to see is unrelenting focus on the economy if we are to avoid a deep recession and high unemployment. And already, as the Cabinet Secretary pointed out, the indicators are concerning, with a larger fall in economic output in Scotland so far compared to the UK average, and already a higher rate of unemployment. And in that respect, the First Minister's focus yesterday on the economy was a welcome one. All of government needs to be focused on securing jobs, on supporting existing businesses and creating a climate where new businesses can be set up and can flourish. And that matters not least because it is only with a thriving economy will we have the money to fund our vital public services. And we should not forget that in the next financial year we will be starting with a £600 million deficit on the public finances due to the overestimate of tax revenues from 3 years ago. But despite the welcome rhetoric about the need to grow the economy we heard yesterday and just now, the actual substantive proposals in the programme for government do not amount to much of a comprehensive plan. We saw a piecemeal range of initiatives, some new, some simply re-announced, without any clear common thread. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, we saw an inward investment plan being announced, despite this being in last year's programme for government and not being delivered. We saw in this year's programme reference to the Scottish National Investment Bank for the 4th year in a row in a programme for government. And other initiatives such as on active travel, an energy transition fund and the LEZs have already been set out on at least one previous occasion. Frankly, there was little here that was new. And I welcome what the Cabinet Secretary had to say about the opportunities to build our digital infrastructure. And she's absolutely right. One of the things we've learned from COVID-19 and the lockdown is the opportunity for people to work from home. But to do that, we need to see a much greater focus on building the digital economy. And again, the R100 programme has been delayed. It didn't meet its original target date. I look forward with great interest to hearing what Mr Wheelhouse has to say about this. But we can't get that right, we're never going to be able to seize the opportunities the Cabinet Secretary referred to. So, Presiding Officer, if we want to see a comprehensive plan to improve Scotland's economy, we have to look elsewhere. And on Monday, we published our own Power Up Scotland plan with detailed recommendations on what might be done to improve the Scottish economy. Emergency measures to be delivered within the next 12 months to create new Scottish job security councils, a hardship support fund for businesses, a town centre rescue plan, community right-to-buy schemes, a Scotland First procurement strategy and new rural growth deals. And in the longer term, looking at how to boost Scotland's exports, both to the wider UK and overseas, plans to reform Scottish enterprise, to improve skills provision with a new Scottish education guarantee to 18, plans to boost research and for a massive acceleration in infrastructure. And, Presiding Officer, we would want to work with the UK Government. It was significant that there was no mention in the First Minister's statement yesterday of the unprecedented £6.5 billion in Barnett consequentials that has been given to this Scottish Government to help them deal with the COVID-19 situation. And we don't... of course.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Murdo Fraser for taking the intervention. I didn't hear Mr Fraser talk about Ferguson Shipyard and building ships for our communities going forward. Does Mr Fraser support Ferguson Shipyard?
Well, I have to say to Mr McMillan, I don't think this government's track record on Ferguson Shipyard is one he should be trumpeting in this chamber. Given the cost overruns, given we know the design work is now being done not in Scotland but in Romania for those particular ships. So I don't think that's his strongest suit, if I may say so, Presiding Officer. But I go back to the £6.5 billion in Barnett consequentials. We don't as yet know how much of that money has been spent or where it is all gone. And of course that money is in addition to the direct support. Of course.
Fiona Hislop. We made a point of keeping every member informed about all the grants and all the information of the £2.3 billion of consequentials, including the unique pivotal enterprise resilience fund, which he has written to me about individual constituents, the creative hardship funds unique to Scotland. So don't come here and say you don't know where it's been spent when we've made a specific point of informing Parliament every step of the way on the business front.
Murdo Fraser.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that intervention, which is very interesting, because I asked the parliamentary question of our colleague, the Finance Secretary, on this. I got an answer just last week, telling me we'd have to wait until the end of this month before we could find out where all the figures went. So perhaps she needs to consult with our Cabinet colleague before she makes interventions like that. Now, there was mention of the UK Government's job retention scheme, one of the most generous job retention schemes in the world, without which our economy would be a poorer place. And according to the Scottish Fiscal Commission's reports published... No, I've taken two interventions. I really need to make some progress. According to the Scottish Fiscal Commission this morning, total UK government spending in Scotland in response to COVID now tops a staggering £16 billion. And inevitably, the First Minister's response to that is to claim it's not enough money. And she's called for the Scottish Government to do more, despite the record investment and unprecedented efforts that have been made by the UK Government to support the Scottish economy. And these calls for additional support are really ironic in the context of the publication this time last week of the annual GERS figures, setting out Scotland's income and expenditure figures, which, of course, the First Minister was happy to laud back in 2012 as, and I quote, making the case for independence. They don't seem quite so keen on them, Presiding Officer, when they tell a different story. Because what these figures tell us is that for the last financial year, there was a £15 billion deficit in Scotland's public finances, and that's before the great bulk of COVID expenditure is taken into account. I really need to make some progress. I've taken two interventions already. I'm out of time. Now, that puts our budget deficit in excess of 8% compared to that of the UK at just 2.5%. I mean, going down the route of independence, which the SNP want, would create unprecedented challenges for our economy and public services. And it speaks volumes, Presiding Officer, that the lines in the First Minister's speech yesterday that got the SNP benches most excited was when she talked about the preparation of an independence referendum bill. It's hard to imagine a more spectacular example of an act of self-harm than to go down that particular route, where the Scottish economy is contracting and when people are losing their jobs. Now, I was really taken by the response from the Scottish Government to the GERS figures and the position they have on fiscal transfers, which now seems to be these are a sign of failure, that they are locking in inequalities and preventing local economies from growing, which is frankly an extraordinary position for the Scottish Government to take. 85% of the fiscal gap disclosed in the GERS figures is represented not by lower tax receipts in Scotland, but by higher spending. We are spending on average 12% per capita more on public services than the UK average. So even a Scottish economy performing as well as the UK does would see a fiscal deficit over £12 billion in a single...
Mr Fraser has to close very soon.
Oh, sorry. Am I allowed?
Oh, what a decision to have to make. OK then.
OK then, thank you.
It was a very simple question as to whether or not the Scottish Government can borrow. And if they cannot borrow, whose deficit is it?
Murdo Fraser.
I'm sure the Finance Secretary is clever enough to know it is a notional deficit that exists. The gap between the amount of money raised in taxes here and the amount of money that is spent. And the deficit now become hardwired where we go down the route of independence as the Finance Secretary wants. But this point about fiscal transfer, presiding officer, is bizarre. Fiscal transfers are a policy feature in every developed country. Stronger regions and nations help those with greater spending needs. They exist within the EU, and the SNP don't complain about it. They exist within Scotland, because fiscal transfers are the basis of our funding settlements for our local authorities and for our health boards, all based on measures of deprivation and local needs. If fiscal transfers are a sign of economic failure, then after 13 years in government, this SNP administration is condemned from its own mouth. Presiding officer, just so I conclude, this week was a tale of two competing visions for the future of Scotland. We had from the Scottish Government this piecemeal programme, from this administration out of ideas and running out of time. And in contrast, from the Scottish Conservatives, we had an alternative, working with the UK Government and not against them, not continually seeking constitutional grievance, but instead setting out positive ideas about how to grow the economy. This programme for government should have been marked must do better. This week, we have shown a better way. Thank you.
Call Richard Leonard for around 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is the last programme for government of this Parliament, but it is by far the most important, because in the next 7 months, we have the opportunity to set the agenda, not just for the course of this pandemic, but for the next decade, for the next generation. We are living through dark times. Too many of us have lost loved ones to COVID-19 in the past 6 months. And all around us, a massive economic and unemployment crisis is unfolding. Workers fear for their jobs. Families fear for their incomes. I've often expressed my frustration at the Scottish Government and indeed at this Parliament for not always fulfilling its potential, for falling short when the people of Scotland need us to step up. I've felt this a number of times over the past 6 months when ministers evaded scrutiny over care homes and testing, when the SNP and the Tories teamed up to block controls on rent rises, and when the Deputy First Minister spent a week in hiding after the SQA results fiasco. But today I am hopeful for this Parliament's future and for Scotland's future, because we have shifted the debate. This programme for government reflects that change, and the National Care Service, which Scottish Labour has spent 10 years campaigning for, is finally being talked about by the Scottish Government. I welcome too the Government's acceptance of the need for a tenants' hardship fund, a case which we have been pressing for months. And I also welcome the First Minister's professed insistence that we cannot simply go back to how things were. But as much as she insists on this, we need action and not just words. And it is on the test of actions that this programme for government will be judged. Because, yes, it acknowledges that times have changed. Yes, it acknowledges the growing realisation in Scotland that we cannot go back to the same old failed normal, but it does not acknowledge that this government left us unprepared for the public health crisis, for the education crisis and for the spiralling economic crisis too. Instead of facing up to these failings, instead of ensuring that Scotland learns the lessons, it seeks to place a sticking plaster over these failings. Rather than starting now to build a national care service, the government wants to set up another review, another working group, a working group that does not even include the voice of the workforce or of those who receive care. So we want to see these gaps in what's been included in the programme closed. And today I do appeal to MSPs from across this Parliament, but I also appeal to everybody outside this Parliament who knows how serious this crisis we are facing, this public health and economic crisis we are facing is, and knows that the worst is yet to come. To the many young workers that I have listened to over Zoom calls since the lockdown began, out of work, struggling to make ends meet, having lost their jobs, now living in fear of losing their homes, their independence and their self-esteem. Desperate to work, any kind of work, but unable to find even a temporary job. So the Young Person's Guarantee is part of the solution. We welcome the concept and we await the detail with great interest, because we have been clear it must be built on a quality platform of a real living wage. It must be better than the Kickstart programme envisaged by the Tory government. We want to see quality, and we want to see decent pay, and we want to see good jobs and good training places for our young people. We want the government to use its financial leverage to ensure that there are more opportunities for disabled young people and that there are better pay and conditions for all. And we have also asked before, and I'll ask again today, can we have a commitment to the over 24s to give them some kind of job guarantee? Because as the Cabinet Secretary knows, and as we have spoken of before, there has been a huge increase in the number of women who are unemployed. Those groups which fare worst at times of high unemployment are once again faring worst, and we need intervention to give a jobs guarantee for all. In recent weeks, I've listened to working people like those bright, enterprising fringe venue managers I met just last Friday in Edinburgh, who are facing the grim prospect of furloughed staff becoming redundant staff. This year's summer festival gone, next year's uncertain. And I've listened to the key workers on web calls over the summer, glad at last for some recognition, pleased at last that somebody is listening to them, but still underpaid, still undervalued, still having to fight every inch of the way. In her programme for government speech in this Parliament in 2017, the First Minister finished by saying that she wanted Scotland to be, and I quote, the best place in which to be cared for in times of sickness, need or vulnerability, and the best place in which to grow old. Those were the First Minister's words. If that was the test in 2020, the Scottish Government has failed it. What has happened in our residential care homes is the scandal of this pandemic, precisely because the sick, the needy, the vulnerable, who are growing old in Scotland, have been let down more than any other part of the population. Last week, the STUC said the number one priority must be to create good jobs through an increased role for the public sector and making support for business conditional on fair work, local supply chains and a green recovery, and I agree. They spoke of a national care service, a publicly owned energy company, a publicly owned construction and infrastructure company, of investment in buses, a local government-led public works programme, council house building and a no evictions policy for the remainder of this Parliament, an end to outsourcing of public services. This is the kind of radical agenda which this country needs. So I do remain hopeful, not thanks to governments or even to parliaments, but I remain hopeful because of the people of Scotland who are driving this agenda today. And I say to them that there is an alternative and that you can create it. Controls on rent rises, a proposal blocked by Tory and SNP members of this Parliament, but kept alive by the tenacity of tenants and their unions. A Green New Deal for Scotland.
Point of order, James Dornan.
This is the second time within a few days that I've heard this calumny voiced in this chamber. There was no vote on anything to do with that bill, and the lie that it was stopped by SNP and Conservative politicians just has to stop.
Mr Dornan, it's not a word I like to be used in the chamber. I think you should apologise for the use of that word because it's not one we find acceptable.
Yes, I apologise for the use of the word lie, but the lack of accuracy in the comments over the last few days really has to stop.
Well, that's not strictly a point of order, as you know very well, Mr Dornan, and I will give Mr Leonard some extra time to respond to that comment if he so wishes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me address that point, because what happened was Pauline McNeill's Members' Bill on fair rents was blocked from reaching this Parliament in committee by a combination of votes of the SNP and the Tories. That's what happened. That's what I'm referring to, and that's the block which I am describing.
There is no point of order in this. Can I say, if members disagree with what is said in this chamber, would they take it up outside the chamber, please? If you wish to complain, you can write to the presiding officer. Mr Leonard.
So we are looking for, and the people of Scotland are looking for, controls on rent rises. They are also looking for a Green New Deal for Scotland, based on proposals for actions, not vapid projections, which the SNP government has shown time and time again it has no intention of delivering on. A national care service anchored in the principles of people before profit, of national consistency but local delivery and good work. It is the workers, the campaigners, the tenants, the school students who will shape our future, who are shaping our future, but it is our duty to realise it. Thank you.
Call Patrick Harvey for around 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A lot has been said about the unprecedented times that we live in and the monumental scale of the task before government, but some things never change. Pretty much every programme for government I've ever seen, I can find some measures to support and some measures that I won't. Large and small. The hate crime and public order bill, for example, it's 10 years overdue to have consolidation of hate crime law in Scotland, and it must result in a coherent approach across all forms of prejudice. I know that criticisms have been made, but as far as I can see, none of those voicing concern have called for the abolition of the existing stirring up hatred offence or explained why other forms of hate crime should be treated less seriously. They'll have to account for that contradiction themselves, but the bill we eventually pass must achieve consistency, and that's what the Greens will support. As for the infrastructure investment plan, the government always tries to highlight the sustainable bits like active travel, but in reality this pales into insignificance when compared to the road building programme, which will make pollution and congestion worse. Maybe not quite a big enough road building programme for Douglas Ross's tastes, but still pretty substantial and unsustainable. And there are also some concerns about what's not in the programme. I've already been contacted by constituents who remain deeply disappointed, even who feel betrayed, that the long overdue commitment to reform of the GRA will not be delivered in this Parliament, as all 5 political parties in the last election promised. And they're left with the uneasy concern that this is less the result of COVID and more the result of the SNP's failure to tackle transphobia within its own ranks. There is always a bit of a tension in programme for government debates as well about being open to good ideas from all sides as opposed to taking small steps in every single direction. The youth guarantee, we obviously welcome that as a principle. It was included in our 2016 manifesto. I think it's been long needed even before the pandemic and the new threat to young people's life chances. But the PFG, and indeed the document that's been published today, state that it will ensure study, apprenticeship, a job, work experience, or volunteering. Now, I think we all see the value of volunteering, but it is fundamentally different from a job. We would be deeply concerned if the Youth Guarantee results, unintentionally perhaps, in pressure for young people to do unpaid work as an alternative to those other choices. As for the Green New Deal, the Scottish Greens have been making the case for what we've called a Green New Deal for many years. In fact, since the last economic crisis over a decade ago. And in the last year or two, we've done a lot of work to develop those proposals. And I'm pleased that other parties are now following suit and using that language. But it's not enough to use that language. It needs to come with a recognition that the old economic system was already broken and a determination to transform it rather than reboot it. Too often, the Scottish Government pursues the option of channeling money to private companies instead of rebuilding the public sector. Energy, land and forestry are examples of this. And where the opportunity exists to do both, like supporting a company like Alexander Dennis to construct the new green buses that a network of publicly owned bus companies would need, these opportunities are not being taken. At the very least, such a green bus fleet for the COP in Glasgow would be a good start. The £100 million Green Jobs Fund looks like a good headline, but I don't think it amounts to a commitment for £100 million in every year's budget. Stretched out over 5 years or so and being paid to employers as business development grants, again, there is a risk that we don't maximise the opportunity for quality green jobs. And at least half of it's been delivered via the enterprise agencies. So on the face of it, it sounds bold, but the budget is small compared with other areas of investment, and there doesn't appear to be a guarantee in terms of the new jobs it will create and the pay and conditions associated with them. The commitment to scale up energy efficiency programmes from 112 million to 398 by 25-26 is of course welcome. And again, it's a step in the direction of what we've argued for. But it very clearly needs to be increased far sooner than that. And the First Minister appeared to confirm that, to agree with Alison Johnson when she made the case for an immediate increase just a few months ago. The government could also have brought forward commitments to change new building standards, which is currently scheduled for 2024. That means we're going to continue to see thousands of homes built every year until then that will need to be retrofitted. We shouldn't be building gas-guzzling homes now, and bringing forward that measure would have ensured that we start building them to the standard that they're needed. There's nothing, as far as I can see, either on addressing energy efficiency in private tenancies, and it's hard to see how the EPC standard by 2030 is going to be met without that. And that of course, brings me on to wider issues in relation to housing. The Scottish Government has shown a long-standing resistance to the principle of rent controls, even though it is SNP party policy, not yet implemented. Rent pressure zones are clearly an inadequate measure, and whether we say that Pauline McNeill's bill was formally blocked or we use a different way of describing what happened, if the Scottish Government thought there wasn't time for that as a member's bill, they could have picked up the proposal and put it into their own programme for government, and they haven't done that. Financial support for landlords has been delivered ahead of support for tenants. Now, no doubt, some landlords are doing their best to support tenants in difficult times, perhaps using a mortgage holiday. Briefly.
Mr. Harvey has just stated that landlords received help before tenants. I would point out that this government has added to discretionary housing payment budgets of all local authorities to help out tenants. And of course, in Programme for Government, we added to that with the Tenant Hardship Loan Fund. But I would point out to Mr Harvey and to the Chamber that this government and this Parliament does not control housing benefit or any other benefit of that regard. And it would be much better if we had that control.
Thank you. Not a speech, it's an intervention.
Thank you.
You'll make up your time, Mr Harvey.
Flexibility. It's very clear that the government is recognising that the absence of a tenant hardship fund was a mistake, and the landlord hardship fund came before that. Most significantly, we must remember that there is still exploitation in the private rented sector. It's not regulated to the same standard as the social rented sector. And even according to the government's own figures published by the Ferret, most of the Landlord Hardship Fund is being claimed in respect of empty properties and therefore playing no role at all in housing policy. So the Tenants Fund is a small step in the right direction. We recently highlighted to the First Minister that the Welsh Government has done it, and I'm glad that she listened. But it was only one of several measures that we argued for, and there are still major questions about how it's going to be delivered. The Welsh Fund is paid directly to landlords, not to tenants. And if any landlord who's already claimed the Landlord Hardship Fund manages to access this as well, with the debt then being owed by the tenant, that will feel like a real slap in the face to tenants who are suffering at the moment. Finally, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Greens do welcome the fact that we'll see a bill on a referendum for independence, including proposals for timing before the end of this Parliament. Support for independence is growing, and it sometimes seems as though the only thing that could stop that would be the sight of a semi-competent UK government. With the prospect of that never having felt so remote, we may yet see Scotland take the step that I believe in and becoming an independent country and a full member of the international community. To keep building that case, we need to inspire people with a vision of what a radical and creative country can do in the face of economic challenges, a public health crisis, and a climate and ecological emergency. We need to act now with that radical and creative spirit if we expect people to believe in the potential of the country an independent Scotland can become.
Thank you. And I call on Alec Cole-Hamilton, open to Liberal Democrats. Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It gives me pleasure to open for the Liberal Democrats in our response to the programme for government laid out yesterday. As Murdo Fraser said at the start of the meeting, it is a programme for unprecedented times. It will close out this Parliament and it will define this government's policy response to the worst emergency that any of us have ever lived through. There is no denying the gravity of the challenges that now face us. Yet, whilst there are several aspects of this programme that we welcome, it represents the sum total of this government's answer to the times we live in, then it sums up the entirety of their 13 years in office. More power than they know what to do with, and a pathological paralysis against using that power to achieve anything substantial. As Willie Rennie put it yesterday, this government's to-do list is always far longer than its got-done list. Presiding Officer, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo famously said that politicians campaign in poetry but govern in prose. And from the statement we heard yesterday, from the contributions we've heard already today, it's clear that this administration campaigns in slogans and governs in sound bites. A number of those sound bites are hard to disagree with, but so too is motherhood and apple pie. Liberal Democrats support the First Minister's call for an extension to the UK job retention scheme, but we also recognise that it is only thanks to the broad shoulders of the UK economy that such a scheme exists in the first place. The First Minister argues that an independent Scotland would have followed France and Germany in extending furlough for 12 months automatically, as if the borrowing impediments of a fledgling nation with no central bank and no control of its own currency were of little concern. Talk is cheap. In addition to restating our shared desire to see furlough extended, the Liberal Democrats would encourage her to work constructively with Westminster to address the needs of those who, when it comes to the support schemes, have slipped through the cracks. And I'm talking, Presiding Officer, about those constituents in my constituencies, in your constituencies, that we have seen countless examples of where they have been unable to access support payments. We know that there are millions of others, many of them contractors, creative freelancers and others, left high and dry when they were ordered to stop work in March. There was nothing in the statement for those company directors either, or entrepreneurs on whose backs we will seek to build our economic recovery. Nor was it there the additional support for Scottish businesses. So many are on the brink now of going under, or on the verge of making many thousands of Scottish workers redundant. Not at this time. I need to make some progress. Liberal Democrats want to see assurances from them about what would happen in the event of more local lockdowns, because they will be worried by the news of rising cases and what that means for them and their employees. In Aberdeen, it took 2 weeks for the Scottish Government to get money to business, and the reach of that support was derisory. The lack of planning, despite my party asking for it time and again, put many businesses and livelihoods in that region of their staff under threat. We now have nearly 1 million Scottish people. I will give way to
Kevin Stewart.
I would say to Mr Cole-Hamilton that the government reacted very quickly indeed to help support businesses in Aberdeen, as many members called for the government to do so. But it would be fair to say that his colleague from the north east of Scotland was not so vocal because he was in Italy rather than in the north east of Scotland.
Ali Cole-Hamilton.
Presiding officer, I'm not going to dignify that with a response, but I am going to take the intervention from Gillian Martin. Gillian Martin.
Oh, thank
Gillian
you.
Martin.
Thank you for taking my intervention. It was to say that if you think that support for businesses has been lacking from the Scottish Government, will you support our calls for borrowing powers so that we can make substantial investment in businesses in Scotland?
Ali Cole-Hamilton.
There are many aspects of the Scottish Government coffers that you could be using to extend support to businesses right now, but choosing not to. We now have nearly 1 million Scottish people on the edge of another lockdown in the west of Scotland, and we should be gearing up right now to support businesses there. Presiding officer, we need to support Scottish companies by helping them to adapt to this new and hostile landscape. And to that end, my party welcomes the government's commitment for better broadband. Reliable, high-speed and high-capacity internet will allow those businesses to expand their online presence, but we need to do more to support them on the high streets as well, so that they can withstand their international competitors. And that is why, on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, I put forward things like the Cafe Culture Amendment in the second coronavirus bill. The aim of that was to help local cafes and restaurants operate safely and be viable in this age of social distancing, because we know the impact that this is having on their margins. Liberal Democrats would have liked to have seen far more for education in the statement yesterday. The impact of the pandemic on lifelong learning cannot be overstated. Lockdown has widened the educational attainment gap. It has created a massive need for retraining in our workforce and decimated the number of international students seeking to learn in our universities, causing massive economic uncertainty. I don't have time. I've taken 2 already. Scotland hosts some of the world's most prestigious educational institutions in the English-speaking world, and yet despite repeated asking by my leader Willie Rennie, this government seemed incapable of or unwilling to put testing provision in place to ensure that those international students arrive this term do so safely. The statement yesterday also represented a mixed bag for children as well. The expansion of funded childcare remains on hold, and with it, one of the most important levers for addressing child poverty. Funded childcare is the difference between a working family making a living and keeping it. For every month that goes by without that expansion, many working families will struggle to keep their children out of poverty and make real one of the most important rights to which all children should be entitled. And on children's rights, I do congratulate the government. Liberal Democrats have long called for the full incorporation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, and we applaud its inclusion in the programme. However, I would remind the Deputy First Minister that it will be nothing without a route for children to access redress for the violations of rights they face on a daily basis through the courts, or for as long as we have an age of criminal responsibility that is lower than China and lower than Russia. You cannot lead the world on human rights from the back of the pack. Turning to mental health, and I say again, the mental health crisis in this country was raging long before anyone had heard of COVID-19. The privations of lockdown or self-isolation and community anxiety will add kerosene to the bonfire of mental ill health in this country, and still it is but a footnote in this government's priorities. Presiding officer, the programme for government speech is the nearest thing in the parliamentary calendar to a State of the Nation address. It offers the First Minister her principal opportunity to lay out her vision for the policy agenda of the coming year. The programme she defined yesterday will occupy this Parliament until it rises for the final time in April, and by any measure, it was pedestrian in its ambition. Presiding officer, the measure of any government's agenda is how it is reported in the press. That papers from all sides today have identified the new independence referendum bill as the marquee piece of legislation for this parliamentary term is as predictable as it is depressing. Only 14% of our citizens believe the government should prioritise a referendum, yet her government will waste precious parliamentary time on it. Furthermore, it gives the lie to the assertion by this First Minister that the coronavirus emergency was so all-consuming that this Parliament could not make time to legislate or deliver policy in areas that were crying out for attention. On climate change targets, childcare expansion, waiting times, GRA reform, mental health, the threadbare state of our police force, all matters of social policy that presented a problem for the SNP, and so it used the emergency to defer action on them. She has failed the test set by John F. Kennedy in 1962 to stretch the ambitions of government and do all these things. As he said, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organise and measure the best of our energies and skills, because the challenge is the one that we are willing to accept and one that we are unwilling to postpone. Presiding Officer, instead, she chose to postpone those challenges and to take our nation into another skirmish around this Constitution, and that, for my party, is unforgivable.
Well, I hate to... I hate to intervene when you're in full flow and there's a flourish, but do pay attention to the chair, please. I've now moved to the open debate. There is no spare time, so interventions must be absorbed. Please, I hope that doesn't deter them, but that's for you. Interventions must be absorbed into your time. Angela Constance, followed by Jamie Green, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. At the start of lockdown, for the first time in a very long time, I thought more about my earlier working life. At a time when I worked in residential care and when I started my social work training, spending invaluable time in the psychogeriatric ward at St John's Hospital, completing care needs assessments, making discharge plans and arranging care placements. And these were still back then the early days of care in the community and the so-called mixed economy of care that was meant to herald in a world of choice and preference for service users of all ages. Much has changed since those days, but much has not. And some of my earlier frustrations in my earlier working life with bureaucracy, financial needs assessment, also known as means testing, lack of services that meant you were sometimes trying to fit square pegs into round holes, ironically led me to a career in institutions as a prison-based social worker and then a mental health officer at the State Hospital in Carstairs. Now, we all know that the pandemic is the biggest public health crisis in our lifetime. And as we look to rebuild lives and communities, we now have the biggest opportunity, I believe, in our lifetime to rewrite the rules and to put right the things that have just never been right. And there are many opportunities to do just that with yesterday's programme for government, not least with that firm statement of intent regarding the establishment of a national care service. And it is fair to say that a national care service is not a new idea, far from it, but it is an idea whose time has come, because it is time not just to ask, but to answer how we invest and care in our most vulnerable yet cherished of citizens. It is time to put beyond a shadow of a doubt that as a nation we really do value care work and care workers. And with yesterday's announcement, the question is no longer should we establish a national care service, but how? And the immediate start of the comprehensive but short review of adult health and social care reporting back in January will kickstart an intense and detailed debate about the choices and about the next steps we can take. There are at least 3 political parties in this chamber that support a national care service. And the challenge for us all now is not just to say, do you hear the people sing? But now we must master the detail and help develop that plan that will actually deliver. Because I know that behind my calls for a national service that is delivered in homes and communities, that strips out the obscenity of profiteering at the expense of care, a service that gives choice and dignity, that behind each of these touchstone issues is a world of commissioning services, care home contracts, regulation and inspection, multidisciplinary teams and workforces and services ranging from care at home, daycare, residential and nursing care. So not the stuff of sound bites, Mr Cole-Hamilton, because we now need to forensically follow the money to know exactly what public money is extracted from the care sector to support private interests. We will need to understand the complexity and the ethics of financial models of care, track the profits that are used to continuously repay for buildings that are continuously resold, and we need to be prepared to dig deep into the performance of all providers right across the public, private and third sectors. And yes, proportionately more private sector adult care homes have had a COVID outbreak. They are larger and they certainly generate more complaints from relatives to the Care Inspectorate about health and well-being. But our ambition should never be limited to emulating a less problematic set of statistics. We will have to have the courage and honesty to take the plank out of our own eyes too. There are many aspects, Presiding Officer, to health and adult social care, and for my part, over the summer months, I issued a call for evidence focusing on adult care homes, and I very much want to continue to listen and learn from the lived experience of residents, staff and the relatives of residents. Finally, Presiding Officer, one of the most exciting aspects of a national care service is that it does not exist in isolation within this programme for government. If we get it right, we build on a skilled workforce, we create valued jobs for people of all ages, an important contribution to the Youth Guarantee and the National Mission for Jobs. We can develop services and opportunities that bring people across the generations together. We can join the dots with warm, cosy, affordable homes, harness the digital revolution and invest in the exciting concept of 20-minute communities and community-based health services, building up communities of interest and place. Presiding Officer, the pandemic reiterated the need for a radical rethink, and we cannot and we must not bypass this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Thank you. I call Jamie Green to be followed by Ruth Maguire. Mr Green, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just commend the speech we just heard? I think it's important in these debates that we acknowledge wise words where they are heard. So I can thank Ms Constance for that. But opposition parties also have a role to play in debates like this, and opposition parties often throw words that are said by a minister or their government straight back in their faces. It's a common tactic that we all use in our toolkit of attacks when it is our time to shine a light of the inactions or failures of a sitting government. And since I've taken over the education brief on more than one occasion, I've used that tactic, holding a mirror to the First Minister and reminding her that education is, as she puts it, or it used to be, as I put it, her #1 priority. A mantra repeated today, the First Minister's questions. In a normal discourse and debate, or a throwaway comment or a tweet, it has limited effectiveness. Because, Presiding Officer, the only true way a government can irrefutably throw back that accusation is by pointing towards their track record. Their track record as definitive proof that the accusation is misguided. Judge me by my record on education is another such famous quote from Nicola Sturgeon. But again, we judge governments by their past actions, not their future promises. And this programme for government, that annual event where the government lays before us its plans, its bills and its priorities, well, the statement we had yesterday, all 40-odd minutes of it, addressed none of the major underlying and serious issues that face our nurseries, our schools, our colleges and our universities. It admitted no failure, no defeat, presented no plan and gave no opportunity that education truly does lie at the heart of this government after 13 long years. And it pains me to remind them of their track record. On early years, let's start there. Flagship promise on funded childcare failed to be delivered. Parents are churning out cash to top up funded hours, which were promised to them but not universally materialised. Nurseries with capacity, but councils with no money. And despite a vote in this Parliament, in the months leading up to COVID, the government was warned clearly that these plans were at risk, long before the infrastructure challenges arose. I did an FOI on correspondence received by this government from bewildered, angry and desperate parents, and that runs into the hundreds of pages. What does the programme for government offer them, I wonder? What about schools? The programme for government neither acknowledges nor addresses any of the issues which parents have been contacting us with. Chronic shortages of teachers and the effect that that has on subject choices. Class sizes going up, despite promises to reduce them. Multi-level teaching becoming the norm in so many of our schools. In key core subjects like maths and science at record lows in international rankings. A ditched education bill, which was a flagship bill in their manifesto. A delayed review into the curriculum, that much needed review. What confidence did yesterday's programme for government instill in those parents that education is their #1 priority? What about colleges, entirely funded by the public purse and with limited means to generate income, crying out for support, and despite that vital role that they play in our economic growth, run by a minister who questioned the size of their deficit and says, I can't give them any more money unless I can borrow more money. And that's from the same government which has shredded tens of millions of pounds in public money on written-off loans, legal fees, project overruns and bad investments, yet still makes credible claims to have run out of money for Scotland's important colleges. Yes, I'll give way.
I think it's important to have context. In my constituency, we inherited a PFI college that had to be bailed out, the first of a number of PFI initiatives that we had to rectify and deal with. When we came into government, parents were telling us, employers were telling us that young people didn't have the skills that they needed. They don't say that now because we have a robust education and indeed college system.
Jamie Green.
Well, let's come back to this in a couple of weeks' time then, when colleges are laying off staff, cutting courses and cutting places to get young people retrained and reskilled. And you can come back to this chamber and explain to us why the underfunded college sector has had to make those decisions as a result of you and your government.
What Before you go any further, Mr Green, we're all slipping into that bad habit of using the you word again. Please Indeed. Remember, the only you here is me.
My point has been made. What about our university sector, which is some £200 million in deficit already, potentially much more? Yes, we were told this morning by a member of this government that we are naive to accept claims from University of Scotland that they are underfunded. Well, when was the last time an SNP backbencher sat down with a university in their own constituency and region and asked them why they're underfunded and by how much? Who are we to believe in this chamber? The minister and his agencies or the university themselves? These are political decisions. These are policy decisions. These are the results of repeated programmes for government which are full of media-friendly headlines but backed up with very little substance. And it's never until the wrath of parents or young people generate weeks of wall-to-wall media coverage that this government actually sits up and listens. Now look, there's much good going on in Scottish education. There's much to praise. No least the efforts, Mr Swinney, of the hard-working council staff, the teachers, the school staff, the lecturers and the parents themselves, because they are positive in spite of the difficulties that your government faces them, not because of them. And all of this, you might want to listen to this. The First Minister has the brass neck to stand up in this chamber in the midst of a global pandemic and say to this chamber that she and her government and her civil servants have time to draft a referendums bill on Scottish independence. A referendums bill, not one on education, not the good food bill, not the gender recognition reform, not the crofting bill, because faced with difficult decisions, this government ditches them. Rather than moving Scotland forward, the First Minister is determined to take us back to the divisions of the past. More division, more diversion, more turbulence and more uncertainty. That is not what Scotland needs right now. And let me tell you, everything you need to know is summed up. Everything you need to know is summed up by the First Minister, who says that she will publish a plan, a draft bill on the question of independence. Well, here's a question for you, First Minister. When will education be your #1 priority again?
I thought I'd said not to use the you word. Try to remember, it's a simple lesson, and that's for everybody in the chamber. I don't need any help from anybody. Call Ruth Maguire, followed by Pauline McNeill, please.
Presiding officer,
Excuse me, I don't care where you sit in this chamber, but it's rules for everybody. No, no, you don't answer me back, Deputy First Minister. It's rules for everybody. You're just one of us. Ruth Maguire, followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This year, we've faced the single greatest public health crisis of our lifetimes. On an almost daily basis, myself and my hard-working constituency team have spoken with people worried about their families, their health, their jobs and their businesses. I understand their concern. All areas of our lives have been touched: our health, the economy, our society as a whole. Everyone's been affected, but undoubtedly some have been affected more than others. We're not all in the same boat. The harms caused by the pandemic and the harms of the measures put in place to keep people safe and save lives are not felt equally. Existing inequalities have been exacerbated, and as is often the case, the burden has fallen on the shoulders of women and children, older people, those with disabilities, and black and minority ethnic people. But we've also seen what's possible, that with urgency and movement of resources, change does not have to be at glacial pace. The rollout of the digital consulting system in the NHS was completed in less than a month. A new hospital was created in a matter of weeks. Our citizens sleeping rough on the streets were given places to stay. An unprecedented support for business was distributed quickly and effectively. Presiding Officer, legions of volunteers and public sector workers made sure that those most at risk in our communities had access to food and medicine and human contact. I know that we're all very grateful to them. But our gratitude is not enough, and I believe now we have not just an opportunity, but an obligation to build on good policy and practice that's been implemented during this pandemic, to bring lasting change and not just tackle but end inequality. And as we rebuild our economy, we must make sure it's stronger, fairer and more sustainable. And we must address many of the deep-seated challenges, the injustice of inequality that so many of the people that we represent face. I welcome that the programme for government aims to do just that and shows determination to recover from this virus and deliver a fairer, greener, more prosperous Scotland for everyone. There's much to talk about in that programme in terms of addressing inequality, but I'd like to spend my time on housing. We've delivered over 95,000 affordable homes since 2007, including 60,000 for social rent. The commitment from government to complete the delivery of 50,000 affordable homes as quickly as it is safe to do so is particularly welcome. In the most recent reporting year, relative child poverty after housing costs was 7 percentage points lower in Scotland than the UK average. This is a significant impact delivered by housing and articulates why it's so important that we continue to progress affordable housing across the country. Good quality, affordable homes, as well as being good for health, support valuable local jobs. They're a good example of creating a well-being economy. Now, I've raised the issue of affordability of housing association rents with the Scottish Government a number of times and gave an example of one constituent who, after a 6% rent increase one year, saw his rent increase by 6% again the following year, higher than the consulted amount, with few or no improvements to his home. He told me that his rent had increased by 30% over 5 years. I believe that as we commit to address unfairness, affordability of social housing for low-paid workers requires urgent attention, and I ask if, when summing up, the Government could comment on what action they'll take to deal with this particular problem. Presiding Officer, any vision to improve our country, to make it fairer for our citizens, can't ignore the constitutional question. More and more people see the constraints and the risks of being tied to our larger neighbour. They also see the possibilities of restoring independence to Scotland. If this was a programme for government in an independent Scotland, we wouldn't have to contemplate the damage of Brexit. We wouldn't have to spend our money mitigating heartless welfare policies, and we wouldn't have to plead with another government to take action. Instead, we could just do that ourselves. Even more far-reaching plans, things our people need. An immediate extension of the job retention scheme to protect business and save jobs. The greater use of borrowing powers to further stimulate the economy. Borrowing powers of any other normal country. Transformation of our national grid to support faster development of renewables. A migration system that recognises talent, not bank balances, and welcomes and supports people to make Scotland their home and enrich our country. A universal basic income and a social security system geared wholly, not just partially, to lifting households out of poverty. Our Scottish Government's programme is strong. It will make a difference to the lives of our citizens, but we could do so much more. And as each day passes, the case for restoring Scotland's independence grows stronger. The Scottish people are sovereign. They will have their say. And as we do the work to build that stronger, fairer country now, that's a day I'm very much looking forward to. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I call Polly McNeill, who will be followed by Alistair Allen, please.
We live in the most difficult times, a time where we expect and demand of our governments and our decision makers to respond in a way that recognises the magnitude of these dreadful times. So many lives disrupted, so much personal loss, deepening inequality, not just of those who previously had lived their lives in poverty, but many inequality that has emerged over the course of the pandemic, of those who were able to manage through it and some who could not, through no fault of their own. I don't think it should be acceptable to say that we can't help everyone by the COVID pandemic. After all, each and every decision on the pandemic response was made, and I accept in good faith, made by this First Minister and this Prime Minister. And I'm sure both of them recognise that they have made decisions for the public good, but have profoundly affected people's lives. At the peak of the crisis, Scotland had the third highest number of excess deaths in Europe. And we see cases rising and restrictions that we've heard already today in Glasgow and West Dunbartonshire. Scotland is in a very difficult place right now. In a sense, we are fighting for our survival, and in doing so, we're all discussing how we can build back better. I believe that we must work together, and we must have a single force, a single focus in building back Scotland. Because with a backdrop of almost 1 in 5 people living in absolute poverty, you'll hear lots of figures, but absolute poverty is the one that's concerning me, and that's after housing costs, and I wholeheartedly agree with Ruth Maguire's contribution on this very important point. Because it's to understand the relationship between poverty and housing costs is one of the most important things in tackling poverty. I do believe that the Fair Rents Bill proposed by myself would have made a significant difference to tenants' rights, and I just want to put this on the record. I take the point that James Dornan has made as convener of the committee, and of course I've had discussions with Kevin Stewart, the Minister. We're not the only party in here that believes that we had 5 years to actually enhance tenants' rights, but we really needed to do it more than ever because of the pandemic. But the government have chosen to not to include anything about tenants' rights in the programme. I do believe this is a huge mistake because it's impossible to overstate the importance of good, secure, warm housing in the fight against poverty. We do agree that Scotland requires an ambitious programme of building new homes, particularly in social housing, and there needs to be a commitment, I believe, from all parties, regardless of who's in power in the next parliamentary term, that we do continue to need to build this level of social homes. The programme for government doesn't seem to commit much beyond that, and I want to say something about renters. I mean, I and Andy Whiteman have consistently raised the issue of debts accrued by renters throughout the struggle, people trying to pay their rent. And these are people who previously had jobs, previously had security, but now they don't. We predicted this. I raised it many times during the course of the first bill and the second bill. I called for it. The government voted against my amendment to create a tenants fund. And I am pleased to see an announcement, so let's be clear about that. I just wondered why it took so long to come to the same conclusion as Labour and the Green Party that tenants would need help. So I just want some recognition by the government that they are actually listening to us. We will work with the government in areas where we agree. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, almost half of tenants in the private rented sector have seen a drop in their incomes since March 2020. It's extremely acute. And I think we do agree that we cannot afford to see mass evictions. I know that we agree on this point, but we need to act to make sure that they don't. More broadly, I think it's important to recognise that, that citizens will need advice on the way forward in their daily lives in a way that they never had before. And I was deeply concerned at Glasgow City Council's decision. I welcome the announcement of the 4 million, but what concerns me about that decision is that the thinking behind it. Why would any administration take from under the feet of its citizens the very service they're going to need through this pandemic? So let's say it's good that they have had a rethink on that. The Scottish Welfare Fund has a vital role to play during the crisis, and the Poverty and Inequality Commission have argued that the Scottish Welfare Fund is currently the most important Scottish Government policy to prevent people in poverty being pulled under the pandemic, during the pandemic. Ministers will know that there's been an underspend here, but just to quote the Commission on this, we are shocked that more of the funding available was not used to provide a much-needed lifeline for people battling hardship during the pandemic. So I do think there needs to be a look at why this is the case. As a member of the Cooperative Party, and to declare that interest, I think that what the Cooperative Party have to say about people having a stake in their economy and owning their future is also quite an important principle. When people talk about building back better, owning our future, I think is also a really important one, because one of the few positives that could come out of the pandemic is that opportunity to shift to an economy which empowers people and encourages cooperatives, encourages different models of business and so on. And just to quote one of the figures, now 62% of people who were questioned by the Cooperative Party say that it should be given priority during the recovery to see how we could allow people to share in the wealth as well as creating it. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I wonder if Fiona Hislop, in summing up, could also address just one other question for the City of Glasgow about the aviation industry and how desperate it is, if she could, in summing up. Thank you.
I'm afraid you may have to write her about that. I'm so sorry. Just the way time is just now. I call Alistair Allen, followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The programme for government is always an important day in the parliamentary calendar. This year, however, it comes at a moment for which it is difficult to find parallels in modern times. The programme for government now, of course, takes on a new significance for every aspect of our national community and economy. So the First Minister's statement yesterday provides some very welcome and substantial commitments to rebuilding and developing our national infrastructure, as well as every aspect of our collective life. Now, many of these commitments will have a positive impact that is felt throughout the country. The decision, for instance, to establish a comprehensive review of the provision of adult social care comes at a moment when the country has, I hope, a new sense of appreciation of the work that care workers do, and the measures to close the poverty-related gap in university access are equally welcome. The incorporation into Scots law of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as others have said, will deliver a revolution in children's rights, putting power in the hands of our young people. Some measures, however, take on a particular importance in rural Scotland, not least in the island communities that I represent. My constituency is set to be the largest per capita beneficiary of the Scottish Government's commitment to deliver 50,000 affordable homes. And we have a significant shortage of affordable housing in the islands, and a housing stock which is ageing and less energy efficient. The investment to decarbonise the way we heat our homes, therefore, and tackle fuel poverty will also be crucial in tackling the housing problems that my constituency and others suffer from. There has been a growing debate nationally about whether the experience of lockdown will produce longer-term cultural and economic changes. And one of those questions asks whether it will really continue to be sustainable in the future for as many people to commute every day in life to an office in a city centre. But that debate comes at the very same time as continuing anxiety about the shortage of working-age people in many rural communities. We need to remember that not everyone wants to spend their days commuting, and at the same time, a great number of people who grew up in rural and island communities would happily move back if only the job opportunities were there for them. So may I therefore make a case again today for us to seize this opportunity to think about what all of that means for the decentralisation, not least of public sector jobs. There need to be more and more opportunities for people in the public sector to work either from home or from hot desks and perhaps rurally based offices, or more likely a combination of both of these things. But just as importantly, it implies advertising people's rights to do this and planning for what people taking them up might mean in some of our rural communities. And all of that, of course, implies connectivity. This pandemic has highlighted just how critical digital connectivity is to so many aspects of our lives. And it was very welcome, therefore, to see yesterday the priority being given to increasing the reach and speed of broadband across Scotland. The Scottish Government has already ensured that the proportion of homes in my constituency with access to super-fast broadband has increased in the last 6 years from 0 to 79%. We need, of course, to ensure that everyone is able to enjoy the benefits of enhanced connectivity and that we get to 100% as soon as possible. Presiding Officer, this programme for government makes no apologies for seeking to build a Scotland that has the powers it needs as we hopefully move out of the COVID crisis. And that means, as the First Minister said yesterday, lifting up our eyes. And that means, lest that idea need explained to those whose unambitious gaze is generally lower, new constitutional powers for Scotland. I'll give way.
Finlay Carson.
Officer, I wonder if the member could remind us when the R100 commitment was first made in this chamber and how many years late it's going to be into being delivered.
Alistair Allen.
Well, as I indicated, I want us to get to R100. I am conscious of the fact that despite the fact that broadband and super-fast connectivity are all reserved matters, it has turned out to the Scottish Government that has paid towards my constituency and others having any super-fast broadband at all. But I don't disagree with the member about the ambition and the need to get to 100% as soon as we can. Presiding Officer, I mentioned that some had unambitious views about Scotland and its constitutional journey. And opposition members who groan at the very mention of independence perhaps now need to consider that people in Scotland can increasingly see what they cannot. Without greater borrowing powers, and indeed the powers to make decisions about things like the future of the furlough scheme, Scotland is constrained in what it can do to rebuild economically. Scotland, as the programme for government makes clear, is preparing to find our own voice in the world. And, Presiding Officer, perhaps the last shot in the locker available to those who have argued against Scotland embarking on that journey. I say the last shot in the locker, apart, of course, from the friendly fire directed along their respective front benches at the moment. But the last shot in the locker available has been the idea and the assumption that opponents of independence have still been speaking for the majority and therefore don't really need to explain themselves much further. There is much evidence, of course, now to show that they no longer do that. So the opponents of independence and the knee-jerk opponents of this programme for government would do well now to reattune themselves mentally to that new reality.
Thank you. I now call Liz Smith, to follow by Gail Ross.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I begin with some consensus? I do think it's very clear from the responses that we've had so far to the First Minister's announcements yesterday that there is a primary focus on the economy and ensuring that we are encouraging willing cooperation between the private, public and third sectors when it comes to meeting that challenge, and that's very welcome. And whether that's in relation to job creation, stimulating investment, economic growth, or of course tackling head-on the immense challenge of climate change, I think we should be grateful for that focus. The green recovery spelt out by July's Climate Emergency Response Group specifically asked for careful consideration of where government, Westminster or Holyrood could invest public money and deliver best value, and what incentives would be needed to stimulate the private sector to invest in key sectors and infrastructure, including within our rural communities, which are so critical to green recovery. And likewise, it called for a future of green skills and employment, and several colleagues debated that point yesterday. And I think it would be churlish not to recognise that the Scottish Government has shown leadership in some key aspects of climate change. So too when it comes to domestic food production, harnessing power, capturing carbon and championing the circular economy. Yes, of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
I appreciate the member's points, but I also, does she agree with me, it's not always about money. And some of the ways of unlocking private investment, particularly in renewables and particularly in the green energy area, will be in transmission and in regulation. And would she join with us in trying to make sure that the UK Government can respond positively to the requests that are made by many of the Scottish companies to unlock that green potential?
Liz Smith.
Well, Cabinet Secretary, I think that's already happening. And it is partly about money, but it's by no means the only thing that matters. And I want to come to something about changing public attitudes, because all of what we're trying to deliver will be undermined unless we can do something to ensure that there are better attitudes. And I want to speak specifically about trying to harness the goodwill and the enterprise within our local communities, much of which we've seen during the pandemic, to give people ownership of their communities. And that's not going to happen unless they feel completely supported. And if I may, I want to come to one particular issue, which, judging by all our inboxes across this chamber, is very real. It's an increasing concern to our local communities, and that is the triple blight of litter, fly tipping and antisocial camping. All very much on the increase, and all costing local communities and local authorities huge sums of money, as well as significant aggravation and inconvenience. And in some areas, these problems have become so bad that they're not only turning away tourists, and how badly we need those these days, but also repelling people in this country from visiting these places. No one, absolutely no one, should have to put up with this situation, and it's high time that it was addressed, because the measures currently in place are clearly not working well enough. And here, do I have a little time? Not really.
I can't give you any time back, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. And here lies the biggest challenge. Because despite the very best efforts of the police, the environment agencies, local authorities, the local communities themselves, to be able to weed out the problem, both the detection of the culprits and perhaps more importantly in the enforcement of the law is proving extremely difficult. That needs to change. And it's all very well identifying this as antisocial behaviour as a crime, which it is in many cases, but if it cannot be addressed effectively, then we are collectively failing. So what are the actions that will help as this issue it comes very much to the forefront of policy? Firstly, it's very clear that the many groups who have come to this Parliament giving evidence, they want to see an extension of many of the local bylaws. In the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, current bylaws allow for a fine of up to £500 for camping in a restricted area without permit, or for leaving waste or for failing to leave when required to do so. There is surely a case for extending these fines. There is a much stronger deterrent required. Some groups also want to see annual permits introduced for legitimate wild camping on the same basis that annual permits exist for fishing, and measures that will quite clearly distinguish between the antisocial dirty camping. But when it comes to local authorities, they often feel that their hands are tied because they don't have the resources to combat the irresponsible behaviour. But they do have powers to report antisocial behaviour and to ensure that the collection of the relevant data is there to assist police and the rangers in their duties. Too often, however, this process is incomplete because there is no statutory duty placed on the local authorities in the same way that there is for the collection and reporting of other data. Now, lots of good things are happening in this respect. There are lots of good community councils. There are lots of good suggestions that are coming from people who've given evidence to several committees in this Parliament about what we need to do. But we need to be able to enforce the law. That's clear. And if that means legislative change, then so be it. But may I finish my contribution about the need to strike the right balance between rights and responsibilities, and ensuring that policy is evidence-led. Because on this side of the chamber, and in the opinion of just about every group which properly represents those who look after the natural environment, legislation in this Parliament has not always been evidence-led, and it's become sometimes skewed towards the public rights, with much less focus on the responsibilities that have to come with these rights. And as a result, that's becoming much more difficult to protect and deliver conservation, and that should be a worry to us all. Deputy Presiding Officer, we need to address these concerns because they matter to all people across Scotland. And if we don't address them, then some of the bigger challenges that we face are simply not going to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I call Gail Ross to be followed by Ian Gray. Ms Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's true to say that the word unprecedented has been used more times in the last 6 months than it ever has before, including here in this chamber today. We have had extraordinary levels of hardship, health worries, including mental health. Young people have had abnormal amounts of time off school, and no one yet knows what this means for their futures. But there has also been outstanding community resilience, support and friendship, neighbours helping neighbours, families connecting through technology and forced into different ways of keeping in touch. And this has posed an issue, not just for those learning how to use Zoom for the first time, which has been around for years, and I had never heard of that before, but for those whose digital capacity can be less than reliable. And even though I represent a huge rural constituency, where some are continuously searching for a mobile signal, let alone any kind of 4 or 5G, this can be an issue in our towns and cities as well, as we have seen with our very own remote voting system in here. So I'm pleased to see that there are plans to invest almost £49 million in superfast broadband contracts in 2021-22 alone. The delivery of 4G infrastructure and services through the Scottish 4G infill programme, backed by £15 million worth of Scottish Government funding and £10 million from the European Regional Development Fund. Committing to our digital connectivity is going to be more and more essential as we move forward with a more remote working way of life. And if anything, this pandemic has shown us the importance of our digital infrastructure, no longer a luxury, but now a necessity. Our rural sector, including food and drink, has been particularly hard hit during this pandemic, with a possible 20% downturn this year alone. We will publish the third land use strategy, setting out how the land can contribute to tackling climate change. We will publish a recovery plan for our food and drink sector, with farmer-focused supply chains, markets, and putting farmers and food producers at the heart of this recovery, making farming more sustainable and profitable in the long term. Presiding Officer, even for those that don't know it yet, the events of the past 6 months will have an unimaginable toll on our well-being. We are a social species. As much as some of us may have enjoyed a little bit of peace and quiet, we are not built to be left alone for such long periods of time. Well-being is at the heart of everything. In schools, it has equal, or at least it should have equal weight with academic achievement. And more workplaces are realising that true potential can only be reached if well-being is paramount and prioritising services accordingly. So the expansion of mental health services in this programme for government is extremely welcome, and it's not just a footnote, because these are really, really important announcements. Yes.
Jamie Green.
The member will be aware that long before COVID, unfortunately, mental health waiting times for young people were unacceptably high. Will you join all members in the Chamber in lobbying the government benches to reduce those waiting times, because it must be done as soon as possible?
Gail Ross.
I thank Jamie Green for that intervention, and it feeds in to what is in the programme for government. These announcements, community health and wellbeing services that will support children, young people and their families, which will be in place across all local authorities in 2021, with a particular focus on mental wellbeing, shows that the government have listened and are acting on exactly the point that you've just made. The Scottish Government will work with boards to retain, develop and support mental health assessment centres as part of a broader approach to improving access to appropriate health as quickly as possible for people with mental health needs or distress. NHS Near Me is another initiative started in Caithness that has helped many people access health appointments without the need for a face-to-face consultation. There were loads of people in Caithness that were making needless journeys to Inverness to access healthcare. So luckily this technology was advanced and working well, so we were able to roll it out around the country. Presiding Officer, one of the issues affecting people in their mental health at the moment is employment. Jobs already lost and the fear of losing them. And as has been said before, the job retention scheme is about to come to an end. So I join the calls for the Chancellor to continue this, as other countries have done, and extend the scheme for those that are still unable to go back to work as normal. And there are lots of really, really good initiatives in this programme for government for employment and jobs, as the Cabinet Secretary laid out in her speech. I want to also mention the £100 million Green Jobs Fund to help businesses and organisations to significantly scale up green, low-carbon and land-based employment and skills opportunity. We cannot and have never disputed that Scotland stands on the cusp of the green revolution. With 25% of Europe's potential for wind, we need to be grasping it now, and it's more important than ever that our journey to net zero is supported and accelerated. Presiding Officer, I mentioned before the community response to the pandemic. The way that community resilience groups have been formed in our areas, they've looked at things with a different perspective, and we cannot afford to lose this momentum. Community planning has to be done from a grassroots level, done by those on the ground, with the contacts and working in these sectors. So no, this is not a normal programme for government, because these are not normal times. Whatever normal is now, we have to work with it, work through it, and work towards a better Scotland, and this programme for government does exactly that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Ian Gray to be followed by James Dornan. Mr Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me begin in a spirit of positivity, of which I know Mr Swinney believes me to be a paragon. Starting with a welcome for those things in the programme for government which can be welcomed. Always best to get that out the way, I think. But there are a couple of really big, even historic things to welcome in this year's programme for government, not least the incorporation of children's rights into Scottish law. And that is something we on these benches have supported for a long time now. And although the commitment was made earlier in this Parliament, I confess I was concerned that the government might be running out of time to deliver it. So I'm very glad that they have prioritised it now. That bill certainly has a fair wind from us, as does, in principle at least, the redress bill, which will finally, after so many years, create a scheme to compensate those who suffered abuse while children in care. We cannot, though, support the requirement in that bill currently for those who access it to waive their rights to civil justice. To say, as the Deputy First Minister did in introducing the bill, that this is to encourage the guilty organisations to contribute to the redress fund is really to leave survivors feeling that their rights are being abrogated to protect the funds of those who perpetrated abuse against them. That has to change in the passage of this bill. Welcome too is the job guarantee, a critical response to the pandemic and to the potential impact on employment as furlough ends. Here, though, the devil really is in the detail. This needs to do much more than extend the existing opportunities for all guarantees, and not just by age range. It also must create new and additional jobs, courses and apprenticeships. It can't simply incentivise employers to take on apprentices they would have in any case, nor can it subsidise them to get away with paying lower wages than they otherwise would have had to. It has to be additional, and it has to be readily accessible and navigable for young people. But if it can do all of that, it is both vital and welcome indeed. Much more disappointing, though, is this programme's lack of anything new to say about education. For years now, closing the attainment gap has been, we're told, this government's defining mission by which it should be judged. We know that the action that was already being taken had stubbornly failed to close that gap significantly, but we also know that lockdown will have undoubtedly widened the attainment gap. Yet ministers exacerbated that by requesting, signing off and then defending an exams replacement which institutionalised that gap. And though they were saved from themselves by a combination of pupil protest and a motion of no confidence in this chamber, the inequity of regrades upwards ended up having to remain. And now schools have returned and nothing is in place to support those pupils who face the greatest barriers to learning. There was supposed to be an equity audit to measure the impact of lockdown and plans to give additional support to those who needed it. That audit is now swirling about in limbo, and the additional support has disappeared into a long-term strategy. Funding for closing the gap is exactly what it was in place pre-pandemic, no more, no less. Indeed, schools have now been told they can use it flexibly. I'm not sure what that means, since we all know that it was previously backfilling cuts to core budgets. And I wonder just how much more is that going to happen now in schools who are being told that they have to pay for PPE and hand sanitizer out of their own devolved school budgets. And as for the extra teachers, where are they? That money hasn't reached councils yet. It is temporary. At best, it can only fund temporary jobs, and we still have dozens, if not hundreds, of probationary or newly qualified teachers who still don't have jobs. No wonder the EIS reported just a couple of days ago that 92% of their reps say that in their schools no classes have been reduced in size to try and increase social distancing and deal with the pandemic. The truth is that we still have thousands fewer teachers than we had 13 years ago, and that has made dealing with the pandemic harder than it should have been. And make no mistake, pupils from deprived communities and pupils with additional support needs are continuing to fall further behind every day in spite of the schools being back. And there is nothing new in this programme for government to help, not even for looked after children, on whom the First Minister lavished many warm words yesterday. Yet the backdrop was yesterday's news statistics showing that children in care's attainment is falling, not improving. 89% of them leave school without a single hire, 65% without any qualification at all. And on the same day, I received a PQ, a parliamentary question answer to me, which turned down flat Who Cares Scotland's request for a tutoring programme for these children to help.
And you must conclude, Mr Gray.
And let me just remind ministers too that they are committed by parliamentary vote to provide nursery funding for all children who defer entry to primary one. We've not forgotten that promise either. No, when it comes to education, this is a programme of a government out of ideas.
No. And Mr Dornan, you weren't in when you were called, so I'm taking Maurice Golden before you. Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The ongoing pandemic is rightly at the heart of this programme for government. As ever, I welcome efforts to both mitigate the spread of the virus and ensure a swift economic recovery. And it is the need to start that recovery that increasingly concerns the public, from workers at Rolls-Royce...
Bear with me a minute, Mr Golden. Mr Dornan, your name was called. You were not in the chamber. You're looking bewildered. Think about it. Mr Golden, please. No, you don't get any response. Sit down. Mr Golden.
Thank you. From workers at Rolls-Royce in Renfrewshire to the airport here in Edinburgh, to North East Oil and Gas and countless others in communities across Scotland. This is an unprecedented crisis, but it is also an unprecedented opportunity to do things differently and build a better country. We need action, and the Scottish Conservatives have set out clear and concise steps to do just that. Job security councils to match skills with vacancies in target sectors and to help stave off further unemployment. A hardship fund to protect businesses forced to reclose because of local lockdowns. A town centre adaptation fund to widen pavements, install cycle paths and make other health and safety changes. We want to ensure communities, workers have a right to buy at risk businesses that are vital to their community. Fiona Hislop.
Secretary. Is the member aware of the £3 million that is already being invested in our town centres, supporting business improvement districts and others to do exactly what the member has said? Actually, a lot of what is in the Conservative paper is already being delivered by this government, and some of it, I think, is just out of date because they haven't caught up with the momentum of action that's already been taken.
Maurice Golden.
I'm glad that the SNP is listening to the calls from the Scottish Conservatives. And another point on this where we would like the SNP to go further is on a Scotland First procurement plan that sees government favouring local suppliers when spending the public's money. We would also use the City Deals model to help our smaller towns and rural areas. But we also need to ensure long-term change too. Our export network needs a boost, and a good start would be creating trade offices across the rest of the UK. After all, it is Scotland's most important market. That would be aided by reforming Scottish enterprise along regional lines to mirror city and growth deals. These new regional agencies would be more effective and client-friendly with an emphasis on scaling projects. We must also look at improving infrastructure and research. A joint UK-Scottish infrastructure investment vehicle is common sense. The City Deal model has already laid a framework, and it would allow joint funding of national-level projects. On research, we want to see more direct investment, 2.4% of GDP by 2026. Alongside that, there should be university spin-off employment grants to help create skilled jobs and new innovation funding streams to target commercialisation of IP opportunities. Fundamentally, to get our economy up and running, we must cooperate for the common good. The common good is what being part of the UK is about. Almost 1 million Scottish jobs have been saved by the UK government, and the recent JERS figures show our public services receive an extra £15.1 billion from the UK. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome certain aspects of the Scottish Government's programme for government. The Higgins report was a welcome step with recommendations to save jobs, reduce inequality and give young Scots a better shot at life. The Logan review in placing digital skills and infrastructure at the heart of a programme for government is also long overdue. Sandy Begbie's initial report on the Youth Guarantee also contains much which we can wholeheartedly support. But anyone listening to the First Minister yesterday would surely have asked the obvious question. After 13 years in power, why hasn't this been done already? And that is not an attempt at scoring points, but a sincere request that things must change, or else Scotland will be stuck repeating the same mistakes and expecting a different outcome. Because failing to deliver is a running theme for this SNP government. Remember Alex Salmond's promise of 20,000 renewable jobs by 2020, which mostly went abroad? Or Derek Mackay's ferries fiasco, which is overrun by more than 100 million and is years behind schedule? Nicola Sturgeon's boasts about the National Investment Bank opening this year, 3 years after it was originally announced, and the SNP's refusal to back our fishermen. The promise to deliver super-fast broadband to everyone in Scotland by 2021, a target now set to be missed. Yesterday, Nicola Sturgeon's call for another divisive referendum was so disappointing. It's the last thing families, workers and businesses need right now. That is why this is a programme for grievance that tries to ignore the First Minister's own record in government. Instead, the Scottish Conservatives want to use talent we have in Scotland right now to save jobs, protect businesses and give our young people a brighter future.
Thank you very much. I now call James Dornan. Mr Dornan, you came in halfway through the preceding speaker's speech. You should be in when your name is called. That will happen to anybody who does that. Mr Dornan.
Okay, thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and my apologies. It's a pleasure to take part in today's proceedings and to speak as the last backbench SNP MSP in this Parliament's final programme for government debate. This is a programme for success and renewal, and it shows that 13 years on, it's still this government that's the strategy and vision to take Scotland forward. Understandably, the announcement made yesterday were aimed towards our recovery from the greatest public health crisis of our lifetimes, a crisis which has substantially impacted upon our health, economy and wider society. Over the course of this parliamentary term, each programme for government has had clear themes running through them. In 2016, there was a focus on education and closing the attainment gap. In 2017, priority to build the economy. In 2018, innovative actions to improve our mental health services. And in 2019, an emphasis on how we could tackle the global climate emergency. In my view, and I'm delighted that each of these government priorities are common threads that run through this programme for government, ensuring that we take holistic actions to see us through the stages of the pandemic. The Scottish Government plan offers hope in such challenging times, and I urge all parties to back it and work with us to rebuild our society and economy over the remaining months of this term. Presiding Officer, the pandemic has highlighted and in many cases worsened the inequalities in our society. Those with the least before the crisis are clearly often the worst affected by the health and economic impacts of the crisis. Through the programme for government, we have an opportunity now to embark on a different path to sustainable recovery, one which will remobilise and reform our NHS and social care sectors, for example, through the consideration of creating that national care service. One which will tackle and reduce child poverty through the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment, and one which will take radical action to end homelessness and support tenants through a £10 million hardship loan fund. This is a time to be ambitious, and no one can seriously doubt how ambitious the government's plans actually is. One of my own personal priorities before and throughout this crisis has been how we best protect women and girls who are isolated, vulnerable and facing domestic abuse. This is an issue I've been campaigning on for some time, and my fears have been exacerbated by last night's understandable decision to restrict many from visiting other people's homes. Due to the imposition of necessary lockdown measures, there's been an increased risk of violence against women and young girls at home, and therefore I strongly support and welcome the announcement of the introduction of a new domestic abuse bill. This bill will legislate for emergency protection orders to better safeguard those at immediate risk of domestic abuse. As we can see, the pandemic touches upon almost every aspect of our lives, and thankfully the programme for government is extensive and far-reaching in order to meet many of these challenges. Presiding Officer, next year's election is fast approaching, and this is a strategy Scotland needs to see us through the short term and over the coming years. The Scottish Government already has a record to be proud of course. New groundbreaking domestic abuse legislation, delivering the baby box, the implementation of Frank's Law to provide that free personal care to those under 65, the creation of a Scottish National Investment Bank, and establishing Scotland's social security system, to name but a few. And the Scottish Government has already achieved that with one hand tied behind their back. The programme for government will ensure that Scotland becomes a fairer, greener and more prosperous country. It's through this government's forward thinking that I am confident, although nobody will take it for granted, that it will be an SNP government who will build upon our recovery plan after next May. Presiding Officer, it's my fervent wish that that next programme for government will be one set by an independent Scottish Government. We get the usual jibes from the soon-to-be ermined Tory leader and the soon-to-be elbowed Labour leader that we shouldn't even be discussing independence at this time. But, Presiding Officer, at no time has independence ever shown itself to be more crucial to the people of Scotland than now. A perfect storm is fast approaching Scotland, the abrupt ending of the furlough scheme and the very real threat. Yes, of course I will.
Alec Cole-Hamilton.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. He says that at no point in Scotland's history has independence been more important to the people of Scotland. Is he aware of polling that suggests that only 14% of Scottish people would categorise independence in their top 3 priorities for the Scottish Government? But they don't want to.
Right, okay. Thank you very much for the intervention, Mr Cole-Hamilton. I've got to say that if I was given a list of 3 or 4 things, or my partner was given a list of 3 or 4 things, and she was asked what's the most important, education, health, or policing, or independence, she would probably put independence 4th. But that's because she'd be thinking in the short term and not in the long term, because those things you have to deal with immediately. Independence is for the long term, it's for our kids, it's for grandkids, and it's for future generations. So the perfect storm is fast approaching Scotland, the abrupt ending of the furlough scheme and the very real threat of a no-deal Brexit. And it's with the powers of an independent country that we would be in a better place to face those challenges. Presiding Officer, it's been clear during this pandemic that when we make decisions for ourselves, the results are better for the people of Scotland. The First Minister has shown time and again that we do things differently in Scotland, more openly, honestly and frankly than our counterparts in England. When, for example, is the last time we saw bumbling Boris face difficult questions from the media? And compare that to our First Minister, who's on almost a daily basis faces the press and takes on the hard questions, though not always to the liking of some dinosaurs in the Sleepy House of Lords, apparently. Presiding Officer, our attentions have rightly been focused and will continue to focus on dealing with COVID-19 and ensuring we can suppress the virus further. Despite support for independence now being majority in settled position in Scotland, it's also right that work on independence has been paused. However, when the time is right, Scotland must get its chance to make its choice, and I have no doubt when we do make that choice, it will be the one that allows us to make our own decisions on our own future. And that, Presiding Officer, will be called independence.
Thank you very much, Mr Dornan. We now move to closing speeches. I see that Angela Constance is not in the chamber for closing speeches. No doubt she'll have a reason to give to the presiding officer. I call on Beatrice Wishart to close for the Liberal Democrats. Ms Wishart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would just, before I start, refer members to my register of interests. I'm a trustee of Shetland Women's Age. As others have done, I'll begin by welcoming elements of this programme for government that deserve celebration. The new domestic abuse bill, which will allow emergency protection orders, is the kind of work by this government that I wholeheartedly support. It's a sensible, progressive policy change that my party has long called for, and I also share the concerns that James Dornan has just highlighted in his speech about domestic abuse. The incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is an ambition my party's had for a long time too. I'm glad to see this work is now set out, and I really hope it lives up to the billing in practice, because we're still disappointed that the work to raise the age of criminal responsibility fell below the level expected by the UN. Angela Constance referred to once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. She's certainly right with regards to the rights of the child. Presiding Officer, it's almost a year since I made my first speech to this Parliament after being elected as Shetland's MSP. In that speech, I told the Chamber about my ambition for Shetland. After looking at this programme for government, I have to say I'm disappointed that the government doesn't appear to hold Shetland in the same regard. Basic asks that Shetlanders have been calling for years went completely unacknowledged again. A Scotland-wide tech revolution is exciting and could be transformational, but there was no acknowledgement that the R100 programme is 2 years behind and that the rollout in the Highlands and Islands is on the brink. The people in Fulla and Skerries would be delighted to have a boost to their digital capability. They don't even get basic broadband service, never mind super fast. And Alistair Allen is right about islanders moving back to live in islands when the opportunity's there. Digital connectivity is essential. I note the headline supporting local economies, but there was no sign of funding for the replacement of the 34-year-old Good Shepherd, the ferry that serves the community of Fair Isle and its economy. A green recovery was another headline, but there was no acceptance of the financial and environmental sense behind exploring fixed links in Shetland. After last summer's by-election, I thought those on the SNP benches would be well acquainted with the sky-high cost of travel to the islands. As their election return made clear, it's not cheap. So it was discouraging, but not surprising, to then see the islands battered around once again over fair funding for the internal ferry service in this year's budget negotiations. The programme doesn't take that any further forward. For visitors looking for a holiday, paying eye-watering sums is difficult enough, and that's no help to the island's tourism industry. But for islanders who need to get to travel to the mainland to access basic services that others take for granted, it's not just difficult, it's stifling. So these costs are not just part and parcel of living in the islands. They're the result of years and years of choices by a government that prefers to look elsewhere. And I see that blinkered approach in other areas as well. On childcare, councils like Shetland have stepped up and delivered 1140 hours. But we know other parts of Scotland are struggling. I was really interested when the First Minister said yesterday that many areas are already delivering 1140, because PQs and FOIs by my party asking to see the evidence have been dismissed. My inbox has been inundated with questions and concerns from people across Scotland about the state of education. From exams to face coverings, schools and teachers have been left in the lurch. Education Scotland seems to have been missing in action, leaving teachers to bear the burden of the pandemic themselves. Last week, a survey was released that showed a fifth of teachers in Scotland don't think they will be teachers in 5 years' time. And new teachers to be recruited by this plan won't plug that gap. That same survey said that only a quarter of teachers thought they could intervene to support a pupil's mental health. Yesterday, my colleague Willie Rennie read out waiting times for child mental health support. More than 1,500 children waiting over a year for treatment. That is shameful. When the Liberal Democrats led a debate on Scotland's mental health crisis last December, the Scottish Government responded by submitting an amendment that deleted the phrase, quote, "there is a mental health crisis in Scotland." Presiding officer, there is a mental health crisis in Scotland. It's just that this government has not yet addressed it. So when we talk about economic renewal and recovery, we shouldn't just be talking about recovering from the pandemic. We should be talking about recovering from the crises that were in play before the pandemic hit. Thank you.
Can I thank you, Ms Wishart? And I call on Andy Whiteman to be followed by Monica Lennon. Andy Whiteman, up to
Thanks, Presiding
7
Officer. Have I got 5 or 6 minutes or so?
Sorry?
Have I got 5 or 6 minutes or so?
6 minutes, Mr Whiteman.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. Yes, Greens were pleased to see the programme for government. There's much in it that we agree with. Of course, the focus is very much on tackling COVID, both in terms of the health crisis and the economic crisis. And Greens over the past few months have focused on a number of key elements of this pandemic, on testing, for example, on housing, on Green New Deal, on active travel. And I think most parties in this chamber do recognise that whilst we're in the midst of a pandemic, we need to ensure our response deals with the present challenges we face, but also to ensure that our response deals with significant underlying issues that have been exposed by the pandemic, including, for example, inequality, precarious work, and insecure and unaffordable housing, all of which raise pretty fundamental questions about a degree of complacency in public policy over the past decade, indeed over the Parliament's existence over the last 20 years. So, for example, as Robin McAlpine today argued in an article on the Source website, if you want to be progressive, you don't give all your tight public finances to corporations. So, for example, £150 million over 5 years for forestry is welcome, but virtually all of that will go to very wealthy private landowners, when in fact we should be devoting that investment to communities, to local authorities and others who would benefit from that investment. A £10 million Scottish Land Fund, for example, straight into the pockets of landlords. We need a fundamental review on whether it continues to be fit for purpose. Indeed, there is much to welcome, as I indicated, and I, along with others, welcome the incorporation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and particularly the Domestic Abuse Bill, getting short-term regulation back on track by spring 2021, and a commitment that's welcome to continue work on incorporation of other human rights instruments, such as the UN Convention on Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. But I want to reflect now just where we are on housing. We know from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others that tenants are facing hardship and reduced incomes. It helps no one if folks lose their home, and that's why the coronavirus emergency powers were so and continue to be so important, and we welcome their extension. But there's a frequent refrain from this government. The First Minister said yesterday, and I quote, "We legislated to stop people being evicted." No, we did not. We legislated for a delay. Now, I welcome the Tenant Hardship Loan Fund, and I thank the First Minister for her engagement on this in recent weeks and on wider matters relating to private tenancies. And I would welcome further ongoing engagement over the coming months. But a loan to pay rent is still debt. It will be a lifeline for some, but not for others, and the details will be important. We argued for no evictions to be allowed for rent arrears, but if we can't have legislation to deliver that, at the very minimum we should be looking at placing conditions in the tenant loan fund in terms of a contractual agreement at the very least, that there will be no evictions for tenants who are in receipt of a loan fund who continue to pay over the term that's been agreed on the grounds of arrears. We've suggested in the past, for example, contractual arrangements between credit unions, landlords and underwritten by the Scottish Government, and I hope we can have some discussion about how that is designed. But, Presiding Officer, I continue to be troubled by the prospect of evictions. We know they're happening, and if anyone doubts this, just this morning my office looked at the records of the Tribunal and found that since just last Wednesday, 1 week ago, the Tribunal has issued 28 eviction orders. 24 of these were for arrears. The people evicted included a pregnant woman with 3 children, a man in the process of applying for housing benefit who had been unable to find alternative accommodation, and a tenant who could not pay her rent because she had lost her job due to COVID. I'm troubled by the fact that we missed the opportunity to properly protect tenants through a 2-year rent freeze, a bar on eviction for arrears, and a bar on issuing notices to leave for the duration of the pandemic. I'm troubled by what might happen this winter, which is why we say there's a need for a winter eviction ban, as in France. Presiding Officer, over the coming months, we will see more and more tenants being evicted. Some may escape if indeed they can handle the challenging eviction orders in tribunal and represent themselves, can persuade the tribunal to use the discretionary grounds to refuse such orders. But many won't. But we are where we are, which is why we need to commit to the kind of fundamental reforms in the longer term in the private rented sector beyond this pandemic. For example, making all eviction grounds discretionary permanently. Stopping landlords being allowed to evict tenants because they want to sell their homes, the tenant's home, or they want to move in themselves. And as Richard Leonard and Patrick Harvey said, very importantly, we need effective rent controls. We welcome the 20-minute neighbourhood ideas in the programme for government, but this has been an idea promoted by very many over a long period of time, but it's undermined by a planning system that's increasingly been a vehicle for securing private interest over public interest. To achieve this goal is very ambitious. Patrick Harvey mentioned Alexander Dennis, the privilege of visiting their factory as part of an economy committee inquiry. The programme for government talks about green jobs, but many manufacturers involved in green technology are making redundancies, including at Alexander Dennis, and I commend the unions for the important work they are doing. Ruth Maguire raised a vital question of unsustainable rent rises, even in the social, so-called affordable sector. And like her, I have concerns about that and about mid-market rents, where I'm finding constituents facing unsustainable rent rises, even as their incomes are frozen. Pauline McNeill emphasised this all, and we regret that the government has not included the elements of her bill in the programme for government. However, providing off for the next 6 months to dissolution will be dominated by COVID. But COVID is as nothing compared to the climate crisis we all face. Greens will contest the forthcoming election on a platform of radical reform, based on the green principles of equality, environmental sustainability, peace and radical democracy, and we look forward to that election, and will continue to support the government in the meantime where we agree, but continue to challenge and oppose where we don't. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Whiteman. And I call on Monica Lennon to be followed by Donald Cameron. Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Speaker after speaker has reflected on the unprecedented times that we are living through. This programme for government is published in the context of and in response to a global and national crisis. And we face huge tests, not only in terms of health, but economy and climate too. And there is much to welcome in the programme for government, but it must not be the final word. MSPs on all benches have much to contribute, and I hope that government continues to listen, adapt and deliver. This programme for government must be scrutinised and delivered in tandem with the government's response to the pandemic, which can often, understandably, change at short notice. And I want to take a moment to put on record our thanks to ministers and officials and the staff of this Parliament who have kept our democracy functioning through a year like no other. Listening to this debate, I am reminded that being sent to this Parliament by our communities is a privilege and responsibility beyond compare. And I believe we all came here to do good and not harm. But sometimes the exchanges in the chamber camouflage the cross-party work and collaboration that often happens when the cameras are not on and is often a catalyst for change. So I just think it's important to say that, because the debate has got a bit lively at times today. And whilst a bit of hilarity and banter is good, there's a lot of pain and suffering in our communities, and we are doing important work here, and we should reflect on that. And in terms of the content of programme for government, as has been said yesterday and today, we really welcome the commitment towards a national care service. There's probably no section of society that has been more affected by this pandemic than those who live in our care homes. We believe this is a necessary and welcome move. And of course, it has been a long-term policy of Scottish Labour. And the need for national standards in our care system is not just a talking point or a symbolic gesture. It's about ensuring there is no postcode lottery in the levels of care someone can expect to receive, and that there is enough resources in the system to ensure everyone is treated with dignity and respect, not just receiving rushed visits or substandard levels of care. And the standout speech in this debate for me is from Angela Constance, She's absolutely right, every single word. It was a very personal speech, some of her professional background that I hadn't been aware of, but she's right to talk about an ethical model of care, and Richard Leonard has said so. I've said so to the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, but we will work with the government, we will work with anyone to make sure that we do have a national care service that does put people before profit, and make sure that we never see the hardships that we've seen in terms of our workforce in care, but also the harrowing tragedies that we've seen, not just in terms of care homes, but the experience of people in their own homes too. And I think what today also tells us is that we have to create space in our Parliament for people to change their minds and to work together. We shouldn't be embarrassed about that. We should embrace that. That's not the speech that I'd written earlier, but bear with me to get to my next page. And there are other commitments that we welcome that are a move in the right direction in terms of Scottish Child Payment. I'll take the intervention.
Ruth Maguire.
Just briefly, I reflect that you're giving a very thoughtful contribution. I just wonder, people have spoken about division, and would you agree that there's a responsibility on all of us as parliamentarians that where we disagree to do so respectfully, no matter how wholeheartedly we hold those opinions that we're pressing for?
Monica Lennon.
I absolutely agree, and I think we do a disservice to our constituents if we let ourselves down in terms of our own standards and behaviour. So there is a lot to welcome in the programme for government. There are important commitments on women's health, which I'm pleased to see as the co-convener of the cross-party group. And I also look forward to the progression of my members' bill on access to free period products, and continue to work positively with the Cabinet Secretary for local government and communities. And I think the commitment to a Patient Safety Commissioner is also really important. That, of course, comes from the Cumberland's report, which is one of many recommendations. But it will make a big difference to have that in Scotland, because, of course, our NHS gets things right most of the time, and our staff are absolutely tremendous. But the NHS also can get things wrong, and partly that can be about resources, about training, cultural issues. And I think this is important because we've seen injustices around mesh, we've seen problems at the Queen Elizabeth. So again, I would like to pay tribute to the work of Alex Neil and Jackson Carlow and Neil Findlay, who are an unlikely trio. But again, it does show that when our constituents come to us with real issues that don't just affect one individual, but are, you know, something that's happening right across the country, that it's important that we come together and join forces. But there is no denying that the programme for government still leaves questions on other major challenges. There's not enough in there about the ongoing viability and resilience issues facing the third sector in the wake of lockdown. The impact of COVID-19 on health and social care charities has highlighted the huge role they play in tackling inequalities and supporting people in times of illness and crisis. Charities like the British Heart Foundation, Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland and many more are vital for support and research, and without them the NHS would be under even more pressure. Yesterday, I asked the First Minister a very direct question about the need to expand access to residential rehab in terms of drug and alcohol recovery services, and we don't yet have a good enough answer on that. On wider NHS investment, Presiding Officer, health boards continue to struggle financially. It was an issue before COVID and it's a big issue now. There are serious challenges ahead in terms of winter preparedness, and in terms of the remobilisation of the NHS, it's far too slow. And just to put things into context, in terms of the waiting times, I know the Cabinet Secretary for Health has worked very hard on her improvement plan, but even before COVID hit, if we'd continued at the same pace, the treatment time targets wouldn't have been met until 2029. So we do really need to all get around the table and work out how we're going to rescue our NHS. I think I'm in my final seconds, Presiding Officer, but I just want to agree with Ruth Maguire, who talked about, you know, we're not all in this equally. Not everyone is in the same boat, and I think Polly McNeill made the point that we can't just say that we can't do enough to help everybody. There's people that we've not talked about in this debate today, family carers, young carers who've had to experience shielding and lockdown and not being in school. And support for disabled people has been stripped away. We need to put that back. We need to build back better. So in closing, Presiding Officer, this year will continue to be a challenge for everyone. And I have to say that we must not allow entrenched views on the Constitution to distract and deflect from our duties. Where there is positive progress that we can work together to achieve, let us do that. And where there are legitimate questions and issues of scrutiny, Scottish ministers would do well to listen. Thank you.
And I call Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I close today for the Scottish Conservatives in what is the final programme for government of this session of Parliament. And I too was struck by the speech, powerful speech made by Angela Constance, and what she said about how the pandemic has given us time to pause and reflect and really question what we're doing. It is an opportunity. But that said, I can't help thinking that in this programme for government there have been many missed opportunities for small business, missed opportunities for job creation, and missed opportunities to ease the burden faced by our NHS. And I will develop that a bit later. However, there are aspects of the programme for government that I welcome and my party welcomes, especially its focus on the economy. And I think it was Patrick Harvey who spoke about this tension in these debates, programme for government debates, and being open to ideas from all sides. There are some things to welcome and there are some things that we cannot support. And in the latter category, I'm afraid, there was one glaring announcement that, of course, stole the limelight, sat bang in the middle of this programme, and that was the announcement of another independence referendum. Presiding Officer, we are in the middle of a pandemic. We are having periodic flare-ups of the virus across the country, exemplified only last night in the west of Scotland. People remain anxious about their own health and the health of their parents, their children, their friends, and their family. People are fearful for their jobs, their livelihoods, even their way of life. And a second independence referendum is the last thing on their minds.
Kenneth Gibson.
The intervention. Can you tell me when the right time will be?
Donald Cameron.
It was meant to be, of course, once in a generation. But that lack of appetite for another referendum is clear for everyone to see, because a poll published only last month showed that a second independence referendum was 7th in people's list of top priorities. So if there was ever a time when just once the SNP might have shown some restraint on the Constitution, given everything this country is going through, then this was the time. This was the time when they could have given it a rest, and they should have given it a rest. And it is shameful that this government thinks it's a priority to spend taxpayers' money and direct civil servants' time to drawing up another independence referendum. Civil servants, I need to crack on. Civil servants whom we are frequently told are up to their eyes in dealing with the pandemic and its aftermath. Moving on to some of the detail, many of the big announcements in this programme for government, which were serialised by the First Minister yesterday, do not contain much that is actually new. Murdo Fraser touched on this both yesterday and today, noting a commitment to deliver a new inward investment plan, but which had already been promised a year ago and not yet delivered. Or the pledge to publish, very briefly, yes.
The Minister responsible was delivering on the PPE and making sure Scottish procurement was delivering for the health service, and officials from that department were involved in delivering the grants that Murdo Fraser was asking about.
Donald Cameron.
Well, that was a promise made this time last year, and it hasn't been delivered. There was also the pledge to publish the Housing to 2040 strategy, another promise made last year and not delivered. When the First Minister said that we will also double to 20 million our flexible workforce development fund, this was also a promise made in the last programme for government. It was welcome, however, to see the SNP government taking on board measures proposed by the Scottish Conservatives. Policies such as early diagnostic centres for cancer, something we proposed just last year, or plans to expand pharmacy services through the Pharmacy First Scotland service, something which we proposed back in 2018. And the approach in the programme for government to community procurement copies our Power Up Scotland plan, except, as Maurice Golden noted, we would go further and focus on a Scotland First approach to procurement by ensuring government procurement favours local business. And there are measures in this programme that I specifically welcome. I welcome the proposals for a green recovery programme, especially for our island communities who desperately need more investment. I welcome the focus on tourism in the Highlands and Islands, especially the Scotland Outlook 2030 framework. And I note the proposal to establish a new productivity club pilot in the Highlands, something that I know local businesses will welcome. But unfortunately, there are also too many failures that have accumulated over many years that show this government failing Scotland. Take broadband, for instance. The SNP promised 100% superfast broadband to every home and business premises by the end of this Parliament, and the First Minister repeated that yesterday. But we know that this simply will not be the case. Everyone knows the R100 will not be ready by the 2021 deadline. R100 is a Scottish Government target, no one else's, and it's a promise made and a promise broken by the SNP. Presiding Officer, I do want to turn to the area of health, which deserves further scrutiny. COVID-19 has been and continues to be, as many have said, an unprecedented event, and it has undeniably been one of the biggest tests for our NHS in its history. Our frontline staff have done a phenomenal job and put their own lives at risk to help others, and they continue to deserve our gratitude and appreciation. And I know how tough it will be for clinicians to temporarily cease providing their normal service and treatments during the height of the pandemic and focus attention on dealing with COVID-19. It was right that this happened, just as it was right to ensure the NHS had the capacity to deal with any surge in hospital admissions. But it is now right that we look to reopen services as quickly as possible, assuming it is safe and practicable to do so. Now, I reiterate our support for plans in this programme for government to remobilise services. But as I stated yesterday, last week we learned there are some 71,000 patients waiting longer than 12 weeks for treatment. Almost 100,000 patients are waiting for tests, routine tests like MRI scans. These are people who are waiting for treatment, who will be anxious and may even be in pain. And they need reassurance, and they need to be given a time frame as to when they will be treated. And I'll be the first to acknowledge, Presiding Officer, that much of this backlog can be pinned on COVID-19. But these huge waiting times have long been a problem under this government, and we need to see an urgency in tackling the backlog. Remobilisation initiatives over the next year are well and good, but much more needs to be done for those waiting right now who need treatment right now. Presiding Officer, in closing, I do want to focus on some of the many important points made by colleagues across the chamber. Many speakers commented on how exceptional, how abnormal these circumstances are in which we find ourselves. We had very interesting speeches from Ruth Maguire and Pauline McNeill on social housing, Andy Whiteman on the tenancy sector, and Alistair Allen, especially on housing in the islands. Jamie Green, rightly, in my view, called out the SNP on their failures in education, and Liz Smith was firm in her arguments about littering and rubbish and what a huge problem this is across Scotland. Presiding Officer, this programme for government unfortunately lacks the ambition needed to take Scotland forward. It fails to support our small businesses, it fails to power up the economy, and it fails our health services, and it obsesses over another independence referendum that nobody wants. That has been the hallmark of this government over the past 13 years, failing to tackle the issues that people actually care about and throwing everything behind separation. In short, Presiding Officer, Scotland deserves better.
Thank you. And to conclude our debate, the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, Monica Lennon, I think, set a really important tone for her contribution to the debate today, and what I think is a reasonable expectation of a programme for government debate where members of the government sets out its position, members of the opposition set out their thoughts and reflections in a constructive spirit, and the government engages on those questions. And I intend to try to do some of that in the course of the time available to me this afternoon and this evening. I thank Monica Lennon for what I thought was a very thoughtful contribution to the debate this afternoon. But before I get to those thoughtful reflections, there are a couple of sort of blunt points I feel I have to make to Parliament. And the first is that I fear that Alex Cole-Hamilton is operating under a misapprehension, because Mr Cole-Hamilton said to Parliament, the measure of any government is how it is reported in the press. I'm afraid that, Mr Cole-Hamilton, is not how it works. The measure of any government is whether it can be re-elected, and this government has managed that twice already. I'll give way to Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm very grateful for the Deputy First Minister for giving way an opportunity to clarify my remarks. I didn't say that. I didn't say the measure of any good government is how it lands in the press. It's how its agenda is received by the press, which tells a story. And it says a lot about this government, that all that was noteworthy in the programme for government was yet another tilt at independence.
John Swinney.
I think Mr Cole-Hamilton makes my point for me. In his response, the measure of any government is whether it can command the confidence of the public. And this government has managed that on 2 occasions. And I remind Mr Cole-Hamilton that we replaced a government of which his party were members, and there were more of them in the Liberal Democrats at that time than there are now. And perhaps he should reflect on that point in the spirit of Monica Lennon's remarks to the debate this afternoon, and perhaps tone down some of the vehemence that we got from him this afternoon, which I don't think was consistent with Monica Lennon's appeals to us. The second blunt reality is the suggestion from Murdo Fraser that the government's programme was outclassed by the contribution from Douglas Ross on Monday. Anybody listening to Mr Ross trying to explain how he would pay for his ambitious third lane on the M8 by money that's already been spent was something of quite awesome and legendary incompetence. And if the Scottish Conservatives really thought that the nicest thing they could do to Scotland was to dismiss Jackson Carlaw and replace him with the incompetent Douglas Ross, all I can say to the Conservatives is thank you for making our task much easier to defeat them at the forthcoming elections.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm very grateful to the Deputy First Minister for giving way. We learned this week, in figures that have been verified by Spice, that the level of fiscal transfer to Scotland from the rest of the UK since the 2007, when the SNP came to power, amounts to a cumulative total of £62 billion. What does the SNP government have to show for that money?
John Swinney.
I think what the SNP government has got to show for that is that we've been returned to office twice with the endorsement of the electorate, and the Conservatives have been in opposition for all that time. So I think that's a pretty good accomplishment to defeat the Conservatives on a sustained basis. And just a word of warning, we intend to continue doing that in the period that lies ahead. Now, having made my blunt remarks to Parliament, I'm now going to try to address the programme for government, because the programme for government is focused on 3 principal pillars around the national mission to create jobs in the very difficult economic circumstances that we face, the objective of promoting lifelong learning, lifelong health and well-being, and the determination to enable our young people to grasp their full potential by the promotion of equality and human rights. And I was delighted with the reaction of members of Parliament and many stakeholders to the announcement we made today on the publication of the bill to incorporate the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has been strongly supported by colleagues across the Chamber for many years. And I'm delighted we've reached this starting point, and I commit the Government to engaging constructively with all on those points. There are a number of central points in the debate, and I want to start with the National Care Service, which has dominated much of the debate. And like Donald Cameron, I appreciated and valued enormously the speech that Angela Constance made on the theme of this is the opportunity, the moment, the calling, the utter requirement for all of us to put right the things that have never been put right. And Richard Leonard has done sterling work on advancing the arguments for a national care service. And the speeches that both Ruth Maguire and Angela Constance made, I think, demonstrated some of the elements and the challenges that we have to confront in the detailed work that will be required should we embark on such a policy approach. But Ruth Maguire also said and highlighted the fact that in the COVID pandemic, there has been a sense of urgency and reform in the provision of healthcare services, particularly on digital consultations and digital services, which I think, in all honesty, many of us think happened at a much faster pace than any of us really would habitually have been accustomed to in health service reform. So what I would say to Angela Constance, to Richard Leonard and to Ruth Maguire is that perhaps we need to make sure that we capture some of that spirit of urgent and timorous reform to advance the arguments around the National Care Service, and that issue will be uppermost in the work that is taken forward by Derek Feely and the advisory panel in advancing these issues. The second major theme was the question of housing, and I recognise that the long-standing interest that Pauline McNeill and Andy Whiteman have taken on many of these questions. And there are a lot of areas where I think there is broad agreement, but we've not managed to get to points of absolute technical agreement on some of these questions. So without me trying to do that today, can I commit the government to continue the engagement with Pauline McNeill and Andy Whiteman and the Greens on the questions, particularly around private rental issues? The issues that Mr Whiteman raised in his closing speeches about the worries and anxieties about winter are issues we take deadly seriously, given the again, swift progress that was made on homelessness in the COVID pandemic, which we would like to see replicated in due course. I'll give way to Pauline McNeill.
Pauline McNeill.
Grateful to Cabinet Secretary. We would wholeheartedly welcome any discussions. I hope the Cabinet Secretary would recognise that your centrepiece legislation on rent pressure zones has failed. And Kevin and Stuart and I have talked about that. And some commitment has been made, to be fair. The Minister and I are in positive dialogue. But I hope there will be some recognition that at some point there needs to be more tenants' rights in this Parliament. It may not be mine, but it should be something.
I'm very happy to, the Housing Minister will engage in those discussions and make sure that, those issues are advanced. On the questions of education, Ian Gray asked at the very beginning of the debate to the Economy Secretary about the issues of the Logan Review and education, and I agree fundamentally with him on these questions. That there is a need to ensure that we have much greater industry engagement and participation in computing education, because the challenges for computing studies teachers are that the pace of technological change is moving at such a pace. We need to make sure that our education system is equipped with that real lived experience of changes in digital technology. And I've had a very constructive conversation with Mark Logan, who's now developing some further more detailed propositions for the government, which I will of course share with Parliament. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the issues around equity and the implications of COVID, and the government has of course put in place £75 million of additional funding to recruit additional teachers. The initial intelligence I have from local authorities is that over 700 additional teachers have been recruited as part of the allocation of that money, which has been distributed to local authorities. And there should be no question, as I answered to Mr Rowley earlier on today, of schools having to use PEF funding to fund hand sanitizer within schools. The government has said that it will make money available to local authorities and has in fact distributed £20 million already to enable that to do so. Jamie Green spent 5.5 minutes of his 6 minutes running down Scottish education and then said, but there's lots good going on in Scottish education. And I would just gently encourage him to reshape the balance of his speeches, to spend the 5.5 minutes talking about the good things and maybe 30 seconds running it down. On early learning and childcare, there are 11 local authorities delivering 1,140 hours in full. There are 18 who are delivering a blend of 600 and 1,140. In Edinburgh, 85% of ELC settings are delivering 1,140 hours. In Renfrewshire, it's 80%. In Perth and Kinross, 86%. In Western Bartonshire, 72%. So there's a great deal going on the ground on early learning and childcare. Let me close, Presiding Officer, on the issue which has certainly divided Parliament, and it continues to be debated vigorously within Parliament. I'm pleased to say it is an issue that is uniting more and more of the members of the public by virtue of opinion polls, and that's the question of independence, where more and more people are united around the prospect of Scotland becoming an independent country. Both Ruth Maguire and Patrick Harvey set out the necessity, the urgency of being able to have the powers within this Parliament to enable us to overcome a number of the challenges on which we are still dependent on the United Kingdom Government to take decisions that are beneficial to the interests of Scotland. We need to take those decisions into our own hands, and I look forward to making that argument in the Scottish Parliament and at the forthcoming Scottish parliamentary election, when my party, for one, will say to the people of Scotland, it's time for our country to be independent.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our debate on the Scottish Government's Programme for Government 2021. Moving on to the next item of business. The next item is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 22598 on an acting convener. Could I ask Patrick Harvey, as a member of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move this motion?
Moved.
Thank you very much. And the next item, yes, a point of order from Richard Leonard first. Point of order.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wish to raise a point of order. At First Minister's questions this afternoon, in an answer to a question from Alistair Allen, the First Minister provided inaccurate information to members. The First Minister claimed that North Lanarkshire Council was not delivering any of the 1140 hours provision. This statement is categorically false, and the First Minister has misled the Chamber. In fact, 69% of early years establishments in North Lanarkshire are currently delivering the 1140 hours provision, and North Lanarkshire Council has committed to delivering the provision in full by the end of this month. Statements like this are disrespectful to North Lanarkshire's early learning and childcare staff who have worked diligently to deliver this programme. So, Presiding Officer, will you ask the First Minister to apologise to those workers, to North Lanarkshire Council and to the Chamber for this misleading and inaccurate statement, and correct the record?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr Leonard, for the advance notice of the point of order. It is a point of information, of contention and debate. It's not a point of order for me to rule on. If the member wishes to pursue it, there are a number of methods by which you can pursue it with the First Minister, including by questions or writing to the First Minister. However, I would thank him for raising that point. Moving on to the next item of business. Consideration of Business Motion 22596 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on Patrick Harvey again to move this motion on behalf of the Bureau?
Moved.
Thank you very much. No member has indicated they wish to speak in the motion. The question therefore is that motion 22596 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And there's just the one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion 22598 in the name of Graham Day on an acting convener be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. I close this meeting.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014, so there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.